That thought sat heavy in my mind as I stood at the trailhead, staring up at the towering trees of the Cascade Range. The plan had been simple: an overnight hike through an old, lesser-known trail that looped around a mountain ridge before cutting through a dense forest and leading back to the trailhead. I had read about it in a hiking forum, a place seasoned backpackers shared their experiences, and the description had seemed perfect. Solitude, untouched wilderness, and just the right level of challenge. I needed this trip. Work had been suffocating, my personal life was a mess, and my head felt like it was caught in a vice. A weekend alone in the mountains seemed like the perfect way to reset. I had done everything right, or at least I thought I had. My pack was carefully prepared: tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, food, water, a GPS device, and a map as backup. I even left my itinerary with a friend, a standard precaution. But as I took my first step onto the dirt path, something inside me twisted. It was that deep, quiet sense of unease, the kind that doesn't scream but whispers. I ignored it. The first few miles were uneventful, even enjoyable. The towering pines swayed gently, their scent rich in the crisp autumn air. The trail was narrow but clear, winding its way up through switchbacks that gradually ascended the mountain. Occasionally, I'd stop to take a sip of water and glance back at the view opening below. Rolling hills covered in a patchwork of orange and red, the distant peaks dusted with early snow. It was beautiful. I reached the ridgeline around mid-afternoon. The sun cast long shadows, and the wind picked up, sharp against my exposed skin. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and continued walking, the trail now hugging the edge of a steep drop-off. My plan was to make camp in the valley beyond, where a small stream cut through the trees. That was when I saw it. At first, it looked like nothing more than a pile of broken branches just off the trail. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't natural. It was deliberate. Stacked pieces of wood, forming what looked like a crude shelter. Something about it felt off. There were no signs of recent human activity, no footprints, no gear left behind, but the wood was dry and cleanly cut. Someone had made this, but why here? I took a few steps closer, heart hammering for no reason I could understand. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches creak. I reached out, brushing my fingers against the structure. It was solid, recently built, but there were no signs of life. No fire pit, no tracks, nothing. The silence was thick. I backed away, a cold shiver crawling up my spine. I didn't know why, but standing there, looking at that strange, empty structure, I felt watched, not just observed, but studied. I turned and kept moving, picking up my pace. The descent into the valley was quicker than I expected, and I found the stream just as the sun dipped below the horizon. I forced myself to focus on setting up camp, pushing away the unease clawing at my mind. My tent went up without issue, and I built a small fire, the flickering flames a welcome contrast to the darkness pressing in around me. The forest was alive with the usual sounds: crickets chirping, the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. But beneath it, there was something else. A stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just spooked from being alone, from the strange shelter on the ridge. I ate my dinner quickly, the warmth of the fire doing little to chase away the cold settling deep in my bones. I kept my knife close as I crawled into my sleeping bag, every nerve in my body on edge. Sleep did not come easily. I drifted in and out, my body exhausted but my mind refusing to rest. And then, at some point deep in the night, I woke up. Something had changed. The fire had burned down to embers, but the forest was silent. Completely, unnaturally silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. I lay there, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound. And then, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent, I heard it. A slow, deliberate footstep. I stopped breathing. My fingers tightened around the knife's handle, sweat slicking my palm. Another step, closer this time. My mind raced. Could be an animal. A deer, maybe. But deer didn't move like that. They didn't step with purpose. I stayed as still as I could, barely daring to breathe. Minutes stretched into eternity. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. The silence returned. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and step outside, the world was exactly as I had left it. The stream gurgled softly, the trees swayed in the wind, but something was different. The uneasy feeling from the night before still clung to me. I packed up my gear in record time, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I didn't bother making breakfast, didn't stop to enjoy the morning air. I just hiked, fast. The sooner I was back at my car, the better. As I retraced my steps up the valley, something caught my eye in the dirt. Tracks. Human. They weren't mine, and they led directly to where my tent had been. I swallowed hard, forcing my legs to move faster. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger now. The ridge felt steeper than before, the air heavier. I pushed forward, each step harder than the last. The hike back felt twice as long, every rustle of leaves sending a spike of adrenaline through my veins. When I finally reached my car, I barely took the time to throw my pack in before slamming the door and locking it. My hands shook as I turned the key in the ignition. As I pulled out of the empty parking lot, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. There, just at the edge of the tree line, stood a figure. Too far to make out details. Too still to be normal. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe until I was miles down the road. The forest nothing but a blur in my rearview. I never hiked alone again. I started the hike early, before the sun had fully risen, the air still cool from the night. The plan was simple. A solo trek through the forested hills, following an old trail that wound up through the dense trees and into the more rugged terrain beyond. I had mapped it out carefully. It wasn't an official trail, but I had found information about it online. An old logging road that had long been abandoned. The idea of walking a path that few people had traveled in years excited me. I wanted the isolation, the silence, the escape from the world. I packed light but efficiently. A small backpack with the essentials: water, protein bars, a first aid kit, and a knife. My phone was fully charged and I had a small power bank, but I knew I probably wouldn't have service out there. That was fine. I had my map and my compass, and I had done hikes like this before. I felt confident. The first part of the trail was easy, a well-worn path through tall pines. The light filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Birds called from the trees, and in the distance, I heard the faint rustling of something moving through the undergrowth. Probably a deer. Everything was calm, peaceful. After about an hour, I reached the turnoff where the official trail ended and the old logging road began. It was overgrown but still visible, winding up into the hills. I took a deep breath and stepped off the main path. The air here felt different, heavier somehow. The sounds of the birds faded a little, replaced by the distant creaking of trees swaying in the wind. The hike became more difficult as I climbed. The path was uneven, strewn with loose rocks and thick roots. Every so often, I had to push through tangled branches that had grown into the path, their dry twigs scratching against my arms. I focused on my footing, taking slow, careful steps. After another hour, I stopped for a break. I sat on a fallen log, pulled out my water bottle, and took a long drink. The air was still, too still. It wasn't just quiet, it was silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. That uneasy feeling settled into my chest, but I brushed it off. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I pushed on. The path grew steeper, winding up the side of a ridge. The higher I climbed, the harder it became. My legs burned, my breathing grew heavy. I told myself it was just the strain of the hike, but something gnawed at me, a feeling like I was being watched. I stopped and turned around slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just dense forest, the path stretching back the way I had come. I shook my head and kept walking. Then I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were fresher, slightly deeper, and they weren't facing the same direction. Someone else had been here recently, maybe even today. That should have been comforting. It wasn't. I crouched down, running my fingers lightly over the prints. The tread was different from my boots, wider, heavier. Whoever had left them wasn't carrying a backpack. That was strange. I was miles from the nearest official trail. Why would someone be out here without supplies? A knot tightened in my stomach. I stood up, suddenly aware of how alone I was. I considered turning back, but part of me refused. I had come too far. I wasn't going to let paranoia ruin the trip. I kept moving. The higher I climbed, the more rugged the terrain became. The path narrowed, the ground uneven and treacherous. I had to use my hands to steady myself in places, gripping onto tree roots and rocks. Then I saw it. A torn piece of fabric, snagged on a low branch, dark green, almost black. I reached out and pulled it free. It was damp. My mind immediately started working through the possibilities. Someone had been here recently. Maybe they got lost. Maybe they needed help. I took a deep breath and moved on, but the feeling in my gut told me something wasn't right. The prints appeared again, this time on a patch of soft earth near a small clearing. They were deeper, like the person had been standing there for a while, watching, waiting. I didn't want to think about it. I picked up my pace. Then I smelled it. A thick, rotting scent, heavy in the air. It hit me like a wave, sour and putrid. My stomach twisted. I knew that smell. Decay. Something was dead nearby. I didn't want to see it, but my eyes followed the scent before my brain could stop them. Just off the path, hidden among the trees, something lay crumpled on the ground. A deer, or at least what had once been one. Its body was torn open, ribs jutting out like broken fingers. The flesh was dark, almost black in places, swarming with insects. But it wasn't the deer that made my skin crawl. It was the way it had been killed. Not by an animal. The cuts were too clean, too precise. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I backed away, moving faster now. The path twisted and turned, but I barely noticed, my mind racing. Someone was out here. Someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who had left that carcass as a warning, or worse, as practice. I had to get out. My heart pounded as I retraced my steps, pushing my body to move faster. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow stretched too long. My breathing was ragged, sweat dripping down my back. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Behind me. Not an animal. Not the wind. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I didn't look back. I ran. The path blurred as I sprinted, my legs burning, lungs screaming. The sound of my own footsteps pounded in my ears, but underneath them, I could still hear the other steps. Closer, faster. The trees thinned. I saw the main trail ahead. Just a few more steps. Then something sharp yanked at my leg. I hit the ground hard, my knee slamming against a rock. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the blood running down my shin. I burst onto the main trail, my chest heaving. I turned, expecting to see someone, anyone. Behind me, nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the wind. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, turned the engine over, and sped out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I never went back. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing. I wasn't alone. I had always been someone who loved nature, the tranquility of the woods, the smell of fresh pine, and the freedom of being out in the open with nothing but my boots and a backpack gave me peace. It wasn't about the destination for me, it was about the journey. But this time was different. I'd heard about this trail for a while. A remote path that wound through thick forest, crossed streams, and eventually led to an overlook with breathtaking views. It sounded perfect. I'd be able to disconnect from everything, and for once, have some time alone to think. But that day, something went wrong. It started like any other hike. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead, the sun just beginning to rise behind the mountains. The morning air was cool, crisp, the sky clear of clouds. I pulled on my boots, adjusted the straps of my backpack, and checked my water bottle. The trail was a popular one for people who wanted to be outdoors but didn't want to face the more challenging routes nearby. But it was far enough from the city that it wasn't crowded. Most people didn't go beyond the first mile or two. I had read online about the incredible views near the summit, and I wanted to see it for myself. The first few miles were easy, smooth paths, gentle inclines. The forest was dense, the trees tall and ancient. I could hear birds calling in the distance, the sound of leaves crunching under my feet. Everything was perfect, the kind of peaceful you could never get in a city. I was alone, but I didn't mind. There was something calming about the isolation, the way the trees seemed to hold the world outside at bay. As the hours passed, the trail began to get steeper, the air thinner. I stopped to take a break near a small stream, refilled my water, and ate a granola bar. A few other hikers passed by, nodding as they went, but I kept to myself. After a while, I started to notice that the trail wasn't as clearly marked as it had been earlier. The path was more overgrown, and there were no signs in sight. I checked my map. According to the map, I should have reached a fork by now. But there was no fork, just one narrow path that seemed to disappear into a thicker part of the woods. The sun was still high in the sky, but the deeper I went into the woods, the darker it seemed to get. I figured the trail just wasn't as well maintained as I expected, so I kept going. After all, I had planned for a long day of hiking, and I had plenty of time left. But the further I walked, the more I started to feel uneasy. The woods were still quiet, too quiet. I hadn't seen a single animal in the last hour. No birds singing, no squirrels scurrying through the trees. Even the usual rustling of leaves seemed to have stopped. It was unsettling, but I shook it off. I was alone in nature, and nature could be quiet sometimes. Then, I stumbled upon something strange. It was a small, rusted tin can, buried halfway in the dirt, with what looked like old, faded writing on the side. It seemed out of place, but not alarming. I bent down to inspect it, running my fingers over the jagged edges. That's when I noticed something else. A faint trail of something darker along the ground, almost like a smear of mud, leading further into the woods. At first, I thought it might be from an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature. But the smear didn't look right. It didn't look natural. There was something about it that made my stomach tighten, but I dismissed it as my imagination running wild. After all, I was in the wilderness, and this was probably nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I continued down the path, and the woods around me seemed to close in. The trees were denser now, their branches hanging low, casting long, eerie shadows over the ground. I kept walking, one step after another, trying to ignore the sense of unease creeping up on me. By the time I realized I had been walking for far longer than I should have, I was starting to feel disoriented. The trail had become increasingly difficult to follow, and the familiar landmarks I had been using to guide myself seemed to disappear. The air was colder now, the breeze picking up, rustling the leaves in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I took out my map again, but it was of little help. The trail I was supposed to be on was supposed to lead to a clearing, but I hadn't seen any sign of it. Everything felt wrong, and I was starting to panic. I decided to turn back, but when I retraced my steps, nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed different, the ground softer, and the path twisted in ways it hadn't before. The sense of being lost began to settle in. I looked at my watch. It was nearing late afternoon, and the sun would be setting soon. I couldn't afford to stay out here after dark. I began to walk faster, my heart beating in my chest, my mind racing. What if I couldn't find my way back? What if I was lost? Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the bushes to my left. I froze, listening. The rustling stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Then the noise came again, closer this time. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. I was sure of it. I spun around, my eyes scanning the dense trees, looking for any movement. But I couldn't see anything, just the shadows and the underbrush. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned back toward the trail, moving quicker now, my footsteps crunching loudly against the leaves. I had to get out of here, I had to find my way back. The sound of footsteps behind me was unmistakable. Someone or something was following me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, heavy and labored, but I couldn't see anything. The forest around me seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. My mind raced. There was no one else on this trail. I hadn't seen anyone for hours, not since the last group of hikers passed me. So why did it feel like there was someone else here with me? I broke into a run, pushing through the underbrush, my legs burning with the effort. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted down the narrow path, my eyes fixed on the fading light ahead. I needed to get back to the trailhead. I had to, but the sound of footsteps was closer now. Whoever or whatever was behind me was gaining ground. I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. The clearing. The path opened up into a small, flat area, with rocks scattered around and a patch of grass growing in the center. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the scene. I didn't stop to admire the view. I kept running, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my legs screaming in protest. I was so close. I could see the trailhead in the distance, just beyond the clearing. But as I ran toward it, I stumbled over a root, falling to the ground with a painful thud. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to gather myself. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. I couldn't make out any details, just the silhouette of a person, tall and thin, standing completely still in the fading light. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't care who they were. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I ran the last few hundred yards, not looking back, not caring if the figure was following me or not. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and sat there for a few moments, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The woods were quiet again. The sun had set completely, and the only sound I could hear was the hum of my car's engine. I never found out who or what was following me in those woods. But one thing was clear. I was never going back to that trail again. I learned that day how quickly the wilderness can turn into something unpredictable and dangerous. Something as simple as a quiet hike in the woods can take a turn, and you might not always be able to find your way back. But at least I made it out, and that's something I'll always be grateful for. The hike may have been over, but the memories lingered, of the strange figure in the clearing, of the unsettling silence, of the footsteps I could never explain. And I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of being completely alone in the woods, and yet not being alone at all. It started out as a regular weekend trip. I had planned a solo hike in the Cascade Mountains, a long but manageable trail that looped through thick forests, up rocky inclines, and past a few lakes. I had done similar hikes before, but this time I wanted to push myself. I packed my gear, water, protein bars, an emergency whistle, flashlight, extra socks, a knife, and a small first aid kit. Everything I thought I might need. The first few hours were perfect. The air was crisp, the scent of pine strong, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on dirt and the occasional rustling of birds in the trees. The trail was mostly empty, just how I liked it. I passed another hiker coming the opposite way, nodded at him, and kept moving. The solitude was peaceful. By the time I reached the higher elevations, the sun had started to dip, casting long shadows across the trail. I planned to camp by a lake about 10 miles in, a spot I had found on a map. It wasn't an official campsite, but other hikers had marked it as a good place to stop for the night. I figured I could reach it before dark if I kept a steady pace. Then, things started to feel off. I couldn't explain it at first. Maybe it was the way the wind suddenly died down, or the fact that the usual sounds of the forest, birds, distant rustling, had gone completely silent. I tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on my own overactive imagination. But then I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt. But what caught my attention was that they matched my own boot prints exactly. Same brand, same size, and they were heading in the same direction I was going. I stopped and looked around. The trees stood still, nothing moved. I was sure I had been alone on the trail for hours, so how could someone have the exact same boots as me, walking ahead of me without me ever seeing them? I considered turning back, but I had already hiked too far. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone else with my brand of boots had come through earlier in the day. I kept going, trying to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. As I hiked, the prints never veered off the trail. They stayed directly in front of me, leading me forward. The more I followed them, the more disturbed I became. I checked behind me a few times, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees, but there was nothing. Just the silence, the deepening shadows, and those damn footprints. I reached the lake just before sunset. The water was still, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sky. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and forced myself to eat. The feeling of being watched never left me. I kept glancing around, expecting someone, or something, to emerge from the trees. Then I saw them. More footprints, fresh ones, circling my campsite. They hadn't been there when I arrived. My heart hammered. Someone had been here. Someone had walked around my camp while I was setting up. I stood up slowly, scanning the tree line, listening. My mind raced through explanations, but none of them made sense. I grabbed my knife and flashlight. I shone the beam into the woods, but the light barely penetrated the thick darkness between the trees. I called out, a foolish, instinctive thing to do. Nothing. No response. Just the sound of my own breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, knife in my lap, every muscle in my body tense. Every few minutes, I'd shine my flashlight around, but the footprints never changed. At dawn, I packed up and left. I moved fast, barely stopping to drink water. I wanted to be out of those woods as soon as possible. But the footprints, they were still there, leading ahead of me, still fresh. It wasn't until I was only a few miles from my car that I saw it. A set of footprints, fresh, deep, identical to mine. But this time, they were coming toward me. I ran. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the trail, lungs burning, legs screaming. When I finally reached my car, I didn't even take off my pack. I jumped in, locked the doors, and sped away. I don't know what happened on that hike. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I was never alone. The sun had just begun to peek over the horizon when I decided to start my hike. I had been planning this solo trip for weeks, and there was something about the idea of being alone in the wild that felt both thrilling and calming. The quiet mornings and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind had always soothed me. I was in good shape and I knew the trail well enough. I had hiked this particular route several times before, but today felt different. Maybe it was the strange calm in the air, the kind of stillness that feels too heavy. I packed my gear into my backpack. Water, granola bars, a first aid kit, my phone, and a small compass just in case. The essentials, nothing more. I liked to travel light. The trail I was taking was well marked, winding its way through a dense forest and then opening up to a high vantage point with a breathtaking view of the valley below. It was only about 10 miles to the peak, a manageable hike even for someone like me who had never been the type to push myself to extremes. I set off at a steady pace, the smell of fresh pine and damp earth filling the air. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the sun filtering through the branches overhead created dappled patterns on the trail. It was peaceful at first. The world was waking up, and I was part of it, just a small piece of the quiet, slowly moving landscape. Birds chirped in the distance, and a squirrel darted across the path in front of me, disappearing into the underbrush. The first few miles passed without incident. I stopped occasionally to take a sip of water or adjust the straps on my backpack, but for the most part, I kept my eyes on the trail ahead. The deeper I went into the woods, the more isolated I felt. The air was cool, and the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees towering above, their trunks thick and ancient. I had hiked this path before, But today, the trail felt unfamiliar in a way I couldn't quite place. There was an odd silence, as if the forest was holding its breath. After about 2 hours, I reached the halfway point, where the trail forked. To the left, the path continued upward, leading to the peak. To the right, a smaller, less traveled route wound along the side of the mountain. I had never taken the side path before, but something about it intrigued me. The main trail was familiar, but the side trail felt like it held something unknown, something exciting. I stood at the fork for a moment, looking down the side path. It seemed just as safe, and I figured I could always turn back if it led nowhere. On a whim, I decided to take it. What's the harm in a little detour? The trail was narrow, with tall ferns and shrubs on either side, their leaves brushing against my legs as I made my way through. The trees here were spaced farther apart, letting in more light. The air felt different here, warmer, heavier, almost oppressive. I shrugged off the feeling as nothing more than my imagination. As I continued, the trail became steeper and the footing more uneven. I had to slow down, carefully picking my way over rocks and roots that jutted up from the ground. Sweat beaded on my forehead, but I didn't mind. The physical exertion felt good, like a distraction from the unsettling thoughts I couldn't quite shake. I had been hiking alone for hours now, and the deep solitude was starting to get to me. It wasn't the silence I was used to. This was a deeper, more suffocating quiet, one that pressed in from all sides. I stopped to rest at a small clearing, taking a long drink from my water bottle. There was a narrow stream running through the area, its gentle trickle a soothing sound against the otherwise still air. I squatted by the water to splash my face, grateful for the cool relief. As I stood up, I noticed something strange. There were no birds here, no squirrels, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the thought. I was just tired, that's all. The solitude was messing with my head. I pressed on, the trail now narrowing further, the trees growing denser as I ascended the mountainside. The sky had begun to cloud over, the blue turning into a soft gray. It didn't look like rain, but the change in the weather only added to the sense of unease creeping over me. It was probably nothing. I had hiked in worse weather before, but then something caught my eye. Off to the side of the trail, barely visible through the thick undergrowth, there was a shape. At first, I thought it might be a boulder or a large fallen log, but as I drew closer, I realized it was something else. It was a small structure half hidden by the trees. It didn't look like a cabin, not really. It was more like an old, abandoned shelter of some kind, maybe a hunting blind or a makeshift campsite. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I moved off the trail, stepping carefully through the brush, my boots crunching against the dry leaves. The shelter, if that's what it was made of rough wooden planks, weathered and gray with age. It had a sagging roof partially covered in moss, and the doorway was wide open, as if inviting me in. I hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The air inside was damp and musty, the smell of old wood mixed with the faint scent of something unfamiliar, something sour. There was nothing inside but debris, rotted wood, broken pieces of plastic, and the remnants of old campfires. But as I took a step deeper into the shelter, my eyes caught something unusual. There, on the ground, partially covered by dirt and leaves, was a large, old-fashioned hunting knife. Its blade was dull, rusted in places, but it was unmistakable. It didn't belong there, not in this forgotten corner of the forest. My stomach tightened. I had heard stories about the woods around here, stories of people disappearing, of strange encounters that no one could explain. I had always brushed them off as local legends, but in that moment I wasn't so sure. I knelt down and picked up the knife, turning it over in my hands. The handle was worn smooth, the wood polished by years of use. It felt heavier than I expected, and I wondered if it had been left behind by someone who had once used it for survival or worse. I quickly stood up, slipping the knife into the side pocket of my backpack. Something wasn't right, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The forest was no longer the peaceful place it had seemed when I first set out that morning. The air felt thicker now, pressing in on me, and the silence was more oppressive than ever. I turned back to the trail, determined to get back on track and head to the peak. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a subtle sensation, like the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the anxiety continued to build with each step. I kept my pace steady, not wanting to let fear take control. The trail was getting steeper again, and the trees were closing in, their branches twisting above me like gnarled fingers. It wasn't long before I found myself breathing harder, the weight of my backpack suddenly feeling much heavier than it had before. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A noise, sharp and unmistakable. A snap of a branch. The kind of sound you hear when someone is walking just off the trail, trying to be quiet but not succeeding. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. For a moment, I didn't move, holding my breath, listening. But there was nothing. The silence returned, just as oppressive as before. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a deer or a bear or something harmless. Still, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The trail was narrow here, with dense thickets on both sides. I could barely see past the brush. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half expecting to see someone, or something, following me. But nothing was there. At least that's what I told myself. I kept moving until I finally reached the peak. The climb had been more difficult than I remembered, but the view from the top made it worth it. The valley stretched out before me, bathed in the soft, fading light of the afternoon. I stood there for a while, letting the cool breeze wash over me, trying to calm my racing heart. The forest below seemed so distant from up here, as though the woods I had just come through were a different world entirely. I took a deep breath and took out my phone to snap a picture of the view. Then something caught my eye. It was a figure, standing at the edge of the forest far below, just at the treeline. Someone was watching me. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure was too far away. Could have been another hiker, or it could have been something else entirely. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring. I had seen enough. I turned and started down the trail, my legs feeling like lead. The descent was faster, more urgent. I didn't look back, not once. When I finally made it back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting for me in the woods. Something that had been there all along. But whatever it was, I had made it out. Safe, for now. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about being out in the wilderness, away from the noise of the city, that makes me feel at peace. It's just me, the trail, and the quiet hum of nature. Last fall, I took a trip to a place I'd never been before, a remote stretch of forest deep in the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a 3-day solo trek through dense woods, steep ridges, and narrow valleys. I had planned every detail, my route, my gear, my food supply. I told a few friends where I'd be, packed my essentials, and drove up to the trailhead. The first day was perfect. The air was crisp, the trees stood tall, and the path was well-worn but quiet. I passed by a few small streams, filled my water bottle, and pushed deeper into the wilderness. The sun hung low in the sky as I reached my first campsite. It was a small clearing near a stream, just wide enough to set up my tent and start a small fire. As I ate my dinner, I listened to the wind rustling through the trees. It was peaceful and I felt at ease. That changed on the second day. The morning started normal. I packed up, checked my map, and set off along the trail. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest seemed. There were no birds chirping, no rustling from small animals, just the sound of my boots crunching against the dirt. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wildlife had just moved elsewhere. Around midday, I came across something strange, a set of boot prints in the mud. At first, I was relieved. It meant someone else had been out here recently. But as I looked closer, I noticed something odd. The prints were deep, like whoever made them had been carrying something heavy. And they didn't follow a normal path. They weaved in strange patterns, almost like the person had been walking in circles. I shook it off and kept moving. A few hours later, I reached a narrow ridge. The path was barely wide enough for one person, with steep drop-offs on either side. As I carefully made my way across, I noticed something even more unsettling. In the distance, at the edge of the next hill, there was a figure. It stood motionless, just barely visible through the trees. I stopped, staring. It didn't move. My heart started pounding, but I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe it was a tree or a rock. I took a step forward, and the figure vanished behind the trees. I moved faster. I wanted to get to my next campsite before nightfall. By the time I found a spot, the sun had already dipped below the trees. I set up my tent quickly, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. The forest was dead silent again. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just my breathing and the crackling of my small fire. Then, in the distance, I heard it. A branch snapping. It was faint, but close enough that I knew it wasn't just some animal rustling through the leaves. My mind raced through the possibilities. A deer? Maybe, but something felt off. The sound had weight behind it, like a person stepping carefully. I sat frozen, listening. Then another snap. Closer. I turned off my headlamp, letting the darkness wrap around me. My fire was small enough that it only lit up a few feet around me. Beyond that, everything was pitch black. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. For what felt like hours, I didn't move. I just sat there, gripping my knife, listening. Eventually, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is waking up to the first light of dawn. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest was still and quiet again. I exhaled a shaky breath, telling myself it had just been my imagination. But then I saw the footprints. They were fresh, circling my campsite. Someone had been here, watching me, walking around my tent while I slept. I didn't waste any time packing up. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack and started moving. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the trailhead. The problem was, I was deep in the forest, at least a full day's hike from my car. As I moved, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I had the sickening feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone, whoever had been at my campsite, was still out there, following me. I hiked fast, barely stopping to catch my breath. The whole time, I felt that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling you get when someone is staring at you. By midday, I reached a split in the trail. One path led back the way I came, the other cut through a more rugged section of the forest. It was steeper but shorter. I didn't want to risk spending another night out here, so I took the shorter route. That's when I made my mistake. The trail quickly became harder to follow. The trees grew denser, and the path was covered in thick roots and loose rocks. As I moved downhill, I lost my footing. My ankle twisted hard, sending me crashing to the ground. Pain shot up my leg, and I bit down a curse. I tried to stand, but my ankle screamed in protest. Panic started to creep in. I was miles from help with a messed up ankle, and someone, somewhere, was out there watching me. I forced myself to move. Hobbling, using branches for support, I pushed forward. Every step sent sharp pain up my leg, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. Then, up ahead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A backpack. It was old, weathered, half buried under leaves, like it had been sitting there for a long time. I hesitated, then reached out and pulled it free. The zipper was rusted, but I forced it open. Inside, there were old supplies, a map, a first aid kit, and a knife, but no sign of the person it belonged to. Then I saw the note. It was crumpled, the ink smudged, but I could still read the words. "He follows. Don't stop. Keep moving." I dropped the note and looked around. The forest pressed in on me, silent and unmoving. My hands were shaking, but I grabbed the knife from the bag and pushed forward. I don't know how long I hobbled through the woods. Hours, maybe. The pain in my ankle had dulled to a steady throb. All I cared about was getting out. Finally, I saw it. The trailhead. My car. Sitting right where I left it. I didn't stop. I limped straight to the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside. My hands fumbled with the keys, and for a terrifying second, I thought I had lost them. But then the engine roared to life. As I pulled away, I looked back one last time. At the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure, watching. I never went back. The day started off like any other hiking trip I'd taken before. The morning sun was just beginning to poke through the trees, a soft glow reflecting off the wet leaves. I had been up early, eager to escape the daily grind and immerse myself in the quiet serenity of nature. This particular trail was one I had never hiked before, off the beaten path, a less popular route that promised an escape from the usual crowd. I parked my car at the trailhead and grabbed my backpack. It wasn't too heavy, just enough gear for a day-long trek, water, snacks, a first aid kit, and a small knife. I'd learned from past hikes to keep things light and simple. After checking the map and making sure my phone was fully charged, just in case, I set off down the narrow, winding trail. The first few miles were easy enough. The trail was well marked, the ground soft underfoot, the air cool and crisp. The occasional bird call echoed from the trees, and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush was comforting. I'd hiked enough to know that nature could feel both lonely and calming, but this trail had an edge to it. The woods were thicker than I was used to, and the trees grew close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. I didn't mind the quiet. In fact, I relished it. I had gotten so used to the noise of the city, the constant hum of traffic, the chatter of people. Out here in the thick woods, there was only the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt trail, the occasional gust of wind, and the distant call of a bird. It was peaceful in a way that nothing else could be. But as the day wore on, I noticed something strange. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. The trees were taller now, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their leaves thick and dark. The path was narrowing, becoming less distinct. I looked at my phone to check the time. It had been about 3 hours since I started, but I was beginning to feel like I had been walking for much longer. The trail wasn't marked as clearly as I had expected, and there were moments where I had to stop and think about which direction to go. Still, I trusted my instincts. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, and I knew the importance of staying calm when you're out on your own. But that feeling, the one you get when something's not quite right, was starting to creep up on me. First, it was small things. A branch snapped behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing there. A rustling in the bushes, but no sign of movement. I chalked it up to the wind or animals, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I paused for a moment to take a drink of water and check the map again. I was certain I hadn't taken a wrong turn, but the trail seemed to be leading me in a direction I hadn't anticipated. I decided to keep going. Maybe it was just my imagination getting the best of me. The forest had a way of playing tricks on the mind. I pushed forward, the trail now overgrown in places, the dirt path almost disappearing beneath the thick carpet of fallen leaves and vines. My pace slowed as I had to carefully navigate through the tangled mess of roots and branches. It was then that I noticed something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The silence. I had been hearing birds and small animals before, but now, nothing. No rustling in the trees, no chirping or calling, just an oppressive stillness. The kind of silence that feels too heavy, too unnatural. I stopped in my tracks and looked around, a sense of unease tightening in my chest. There were no sounds, no insects, no birds, just the dull rustling of the wind moving through the trees. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe slowly. This wasn't the usual quiet you'd get in a remote forest. It was an unsettling silence, one that seemed to press in on you, as though the very air itself was waiting for something to happen. I continued on, albeit with more caution. The trail had started to disappear, the once clear path now just a faint suggestion of where it used to be. I stepped carefully, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of where I should go next. And then I found it. There, just ahead, was a small clearing. It wasn't much, just an open space where the trees seemed to part for a moment. In the middle of the clearing was a large, flat rock, covered in moss and lichen. It looked like a place where people might have rested in the past, but there was something off about it. A strange chill in the air that made me hesitate before stepping closer. I took a few steps into the clearing, my boots crunching softly on the dry leaves. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for the first time that day, I felt truly uneasy. Something about the clearing felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. My eyes scanned the surroundings. The trees were too still, the silence too complete. There were no signs of animals, no sounds of wind. It was as though the entire world had stopped. I moved closer to the rock, my breath shallow. As I reached the edge of the clearing, something caught my eye. A small object, half hidden in the undergrowth. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized it. It was a backpack, but not just any backpack. This one was old, worn, and covered in dirt. The straps were frayed, the zippers rusted. I knelt down to examine it, my pulse quickening. There was no sign of anyone around, but the backpack was clearly abandoned, left behind in a hurry. I opened it cautiously, afraid of what I might find inside. It was mostly empty, save for a few items. An old, weathered map, a half-eaten energy bar, and a small notebook. I flipped through the pages of the notebook. The handwriting was messy, hurried. The entries didn't make much sense, at least not at first. They talked about getting lost, about hearing strange noises, about a sense of being followed. The last entry, though, sent a jolt of fear through me. I hear them now. They're closer. They always get closer, no matter how fast I run. Don't stop. Don't ever stop. I closed the notebook quickly, my hands shaking. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I stood up, scanning the trees once again. The silence was back, heavier now. I had to get out of there. I didn't know what was going on, but this place felt wrong, deeply wrong. I turned to leave, but just as I did, I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not mine, not the sound of a hiker. These were heavier, slower, like something large and deliberate was moving through the brush. My heart started racing. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty trees, the same oppressive quiet. I started walking faster, then breaking into a jog. My breath was coming in quick, shallow gasps. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore, just that I needed to get out, to get away from whatever was out there in the woods with me. The trail had completely disappeared, replaced by dense undergrowth and twisted vines. I was running blindly now, pushing through the branches, feeling them scrape at my arms. I didn't care. I just needed to escape. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning. I was running on pure instinct now, the fear driving me forward, the image of the abandoned backpack and its haunting words flashing in my mind. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the forest opened up again. I stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath. There was a dirt path ahead, one that seemed familiar. I had no idea how, but somehow, I had found my way back to the main trail. I didn't hesitate. I ran, as fast as I could, back toward the trailhead. The trees gradually thinned out, the quiet broken by the sounds of the wind and distant birds once again. My heart was still pounding, my legs aching, but I didn't stop until I reached my car. I slammed the door shut behind me, the engine roaring to life. As I pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the woods, that I had narrowly escaped whatever it was that had followed me. I don't know who left that backpack or what happened to them, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never set foot on that trail again. I had been hiking for hours, the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the forest floor the only sound breaking the silence. The sun had long since passed its peak, casting long shadows across the trail, which had started to narrow as I climbed higher into the hills. My pack felt heavier with each step, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, soaking my shirt. The air smelled damp, thick with the scent of pine and wet earth, as if the forest had recently been soaked by a rainstorm. The trail I was on was supposed to be one of the more popular routes, according to the maps I had checked before heading out. but I hadn't passed anyone for the past couple of hours. The path had started off wide and clear, but now it had become little more than a narrow track through the underbrush. The leaves on the trees overhead rustled softly in the wind, but there was a quietness here that felt different from other hikes I'd done before. It was as if the forest had its own secret, a feeling that crept under my skin and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I checked my watch. 4:45 p.m. I had about an hour before the sun would dip below the horizon, and I knew I still had a couple of miles to go before reaching the campsite I'd planned to stay at. At least I thought I did. The map I was following had shown the trail winding up the mountain, but the way seemed to be changing. The markings on the trees that I'd been using to guide me were becoming less frequent, and I was starting to question whether I had missed a turn somewhere. My heart started to race a little, but I pushed the thought away. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I paused to take a breath, wiping my brow with the back of my hand. It felt like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I scanned the area around me. The trees were denser now, their branches reaching out in all directions, blocking most of the light. The ground was soft here, and I could hear the faint sound of running water, but I couldn't see a stream. Just keep moving, I muttered to myself. The campsite is just ahead. I continued on, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. With every step, the forest seemed to get thicker, the trail less defined. It was as if the landscape itself was shifting, closing in around me. The noise of the wind through the leaves had stopped, and the usual birdsong had gone quiet. The only thing I could hear now was my own breath and the steady beat of my heart. And then I saw it. A small clearing opened up ahead, barely wide enough to stretch out my arms. In the middle of the clearing, a stone well stood, half hidden by the encroaching forest. The well wasn't something I expected to find on a hiking trail, certainly not out here, miles from the nearest road. It looked old, like it had been abandoned long ago, the stonework crumbling in places. The air felt colder near it, and there was a strange, still quality to the space around it. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to approach, but curiosity got the better of me. I moved closer, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. The well was deep, the opening covered by a rusted iron grate. There was no sign of water in it, just darkness. It made my stomach churn. I stood there for a moment, just staring into the blackness. Something made a sound behind me, a snap of a twig, followed by the distant rustle of leaves. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. "It's just a well," I muttered. "Get a grip." But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A piece of fabric, caught in the underbrush just beyond the well. I stepped closer, my curiosity piqued. It was a small scrap of dark cloth, caught on a thorny bush. The fabric looked worn, frayed at the edges, like it had been there for years. I reached out to tug it free, but then I noticed something strange. There were dark stains on it. Not the kind of stains you'd expect from dirt or mud, but something deeper, almost black. Something that looked like blood. My stomach turned. I quickly stepped back, the piece of fabric still hanging in the bushes. A flash of cold fear shot through me, and the hairs on my arms stood up. This was wrong. This wasn't just some random abandoned well. I turned and looked around, my heart racing. The clearing was still quiet, but now there was something off about it. The trail I had been following had almost completely disappeared, swallowed by the thick trees. It was like I was standing in a place that didn't belong. I forced myself to take a deep breath and turn to leave the clearing, but before I could take a single step, I heard it again. A rustling sound, this time closer, followed by the distinct snap of a twig. I whipped around, my heart pounding. Nothing. No one. I swallowed hard and started walking faster, back toward the path I'd been following. But the trail was gone. In its place was just dense forest, dark and oppressive. The trees felt too close, the air too thick. I pushed through the branches, trying to force my way back to the trail, but it was as though the forest itself had changed, grown in on me. Panic began to rise in my chest. I pulled out my phone to check the map, but the screen was frozen. I tried again and then again, but there was nothing. No signal. My breath quickened as I scanned the area around me. I couldn't even hear the usual forest sounds anymore. The birds, the wind, the distant rustling of animals. Nothing. I was alone, completely alone. My legs felt heavy, and my mind raced as I stumbled forward, trying to retrace my steps. The light was fading now, the sky turning to a deep purple as the sun sank lower. I needed to find shelter. I needed to get out of here before the night closed in completely. As I pushed through the thick underbrush, I saw something ahead, a faint light, flickering like the glow of a campfire. I stumbled forward, my pulse quickening with hope. Maybe there were other hikers up ahead, or even the campsite I'd been aiming for. But as I drew closer, I realized something wasn't right. The light wasn't from a fire. It was more like a pale, unnatural glow, shimmering in the air. It was coming from a small clearing, just beyond a dense thicket of trees. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I pushed forward, driven by the need to escape the feeling of being trapped. The clearing was small, just like the one I had found earlier, but the atmosphere was completely different. The air here was thick, heavy with a kind of strange, unexplainable tension. The light came from a small, glowing stone in the center of the clearing, casting eerie shadows around it. And there, in the middle of it all, was a figure, a man hunched over, his back to me. He was dressed in dark clothes, almost blending into the shadows of the trees. I froze. My mouth went dry, my heart pounding in my chest. Then the figure turned. His face was pale, drawn, his eyes wide with a kind of hollow emptiness. He stared at me for a moment, and in his gaze, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. It wasn't just the way he looked, it was the way he was. It was as if he didn't belong in this world at all. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body felt like it was stuck in place, paralyzed by fear. The man took a slow step toward me, his movements stiff, unnatural. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, vanished, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. I blinked, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The clearing was empty. The glowing stone still lay in the center, but the figure was gone. I didn't waste another second. I turned and ran, pushing through the underbrush, not caring which direction I was going anymore. I just needed to get out of that place, away from whatever it was that I had stumbled into. It felt like hours passed, but when I finally broke through the trees and emerged onto a familiar trail, I collapsed onto the ground. My chest heaved with the effort of running, my mind spinning with confusion and fear. The sun had fully set now, and the world around me was bathed in the eerie, inky blackness of night. Somehow I had made it back. I wasn't lost anymore, but as I sat there, panting and trying to calm my racing thoughts, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something I would never fully understand, something that had been watching me the entire time. And maybe, just maybe, it was still out there. I had always enjoyed the idea of hiking in remote places, away from the bustling noise of the city, where the air felt purer and the land seemed untouched. The mountain range I chose for my hike, a series of low hills and dense forests, was known for being quiet and often overlooked by other hikers. I liked that. I had spent months planning the trip. The thought of solitude, the challenge of the terrain, and the promise of fresh air kept me motivated. I packed my backpack with the essentials: water, a first aid kit, a map, and some food. Nothing extravagant, just the basics to survive for a weekend. The trailhead was located at the base of a small valley, flanked by thick woods on either side. I arrived at the parking lot around 7 a.m., the sky still gray with the remnants of dawn. There was no one around, which seemed normal for a trail like this. The quietness was both inviting and eerie. I took a deep breath, adjusted my pack, and began walking. The first part of the trail was easy. The path was wide, with soft dirt beneath my boots and the scent of pine trees surrounding me. The forest was dense but not oppressive. I could hear birds in the distance, their calls echoing between the trees. The temperature was cool, and I felt my body gradually warm up as I walked. The farther I went, the less the sound of the birds seemed to reach me. It was strange, but I dismissed it as normal. Maybe the birds were just further away. I passed a few streams, their water clear and cool, running over rocks that shimmered in the soft morning light. The trail twisted and turned, winding up the side of the valley, and after about an hour of walking, the gentle climb became steeper. My legs began to burn, but I welcomed the challenge. I took a break near a small creek, sitting on a flat rock and sipping water. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, but there was something off. It wasn't the usual background noise of wildlife. It was quieter, almost unnervingly quiet. I shrugged it off, standing up and stretching my stiff muscles. The path ahead was less maintained now. The dirt was loose, and the occasional fallen branch made the trail difficult to follow. Still, I kept moving. The further I went, the more I realized how isolated I was. I hadn't seen anyone since I left the parking lot, and there were no signs of human presence anywhere. No markers on trees, no signs, no trail maps. Nothing. But that was okay. I enjoyed being alone with my thoughts. After another hour of hiking, the sun had fully risen, and the forest seemed to change. The trees grew taller and more closely packed, their thick trunks casting deep shadows. I was in the heart of the wilderness now, and the path was starting to disappear beneath the underbrush. I had to carefully step over rocks, roots, and fallen branches. It felt like I was venturing deeper into uncharted territory. Suddenly, the silence hit me again. It was even worse this time. The birds, which had been so active earlier, were completely gone. I couldn't hear a single rustle of leaves. I stopped for a moment, standing in the middle of the trail. The air felt heavier now, and my breath seemed louder than it should have been. I looked around, squinting in the dappled light, trying to spot any movement, but there was nothing. A shiver ran down my spine. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. After all, I was far from civilization. Nature had its moods, right? I continued walking, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me, growing stronger with each step. My gut told me something was wrong, but I pushed it aside. It was probably just the isolation getting to me. A few minutes later, I came across something strange. A small clearing opened up in the woods, and in the center was a pile of rocks. It wasn't just a random pile, though. It was a carefully stacked formation, almost like a small cairn, though it didn't look like it had been made by hikers. It was too precise. I approached it, curious, my boots crunching on the dried leaves beneath me. As I got closer, I noticed something else. What appeared to be small, worn-out items scattered around the rocks. Bits of cloth, a broken watch, an old leather strap. My heart began to race. I knelt down, inspecting the items. They didn't belong here, not in a place like this. The watch looked old, perhaps from the 70s or 80s. The cloth pieces were torn, as if they had been through something violent. I stood up quickly, suddenly aware of how uncomfortable I felt. The pile of rocks now seemed ominous. What was I doing here? I looked around, hoping for some sign of where the trail had gone. But there was nothing, only trees and more trees. I checked my map, but it was useless. The trail wasn't marked here, and the map didn't indicate any clearing like this. I felt a knot form in my stomach. As I stood there, trying to decide whether to move forward or turn back, I heard something, a faint sound, almost like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my heart pounding. I looked over my shoulder, but saw nothing. No movement in the trees, no sign of anyone. I felt a cold sweat begin to form on my forehead. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling more than I intended. The silence that followed was deafening. I waited, expecting an answer, but there was nothing. Could have been an animal, I thought. But why did it feel like I wasn't alone? I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. I decided to leave the clearing and continue on the path, though I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. I felt like I needed to get out of here, back to where there were people. I retraced my steps, trying to find the last recognizable part of the trail. But the forest was disorienting. It felt like it was closing in on me, and the further I went, the more the trees seemed to blur together. Time seemed to stretch out, and I found myself walking for what felt like hours, unable to find my way back. I had no idea where I was. The daylight was starting to fade, and a chill had settled over the forest. I stopped to catch my breath, realizing how much I had been pushing myself. I pulled out my map again, but it was no use. I was lost. Just then, I heard something else. A loud crack, like a branch snapping, not far off. My heart leaped in my chest. I spun around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the forest remained still. I wasn't alone. Something was out there, watching me. The thought sent a surge of panic through me. I had to move. I couldn't stay here any longer. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away from whatever was in the woods with me. My legs burned as I pushed forward, stumbling over rocks and branches, until I could see a break in the trees. A clearing. It was the trail, the main path. I wasn't sure how, but somehow I had found it again. I kept running, not daring to slow down. The clearing opened up into a small hill, and there, in the distance, I saw the parking lot. I made it back to my car, panting and drenched in sweat. I didn't stop to look back. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove off as fast as I could. The forest, dark and oppressive behind me, seemed to breathe a final sigh as I left it. I've been back home for 2 days now, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. I keep hearing those footsteps in my head, slow and deliberate, and I wonder if I was ever truly alone on that hike. I always loved the outdoors. It was my escape from the noise and stress of daily life. When the weather was right, I'd pack up and head for the hills. No destination in particular, just a longing for the quiet and peace only nature could offer. So, when the weather turned crisp and the air was sharp with the bite of autumn, I couldn't resist. I'd already made a rough plan in my mind. A weekend hike deep into the woods, far from the tourist trails. I wasn't afraid to get lost. In fact, I welcomed it. I set out at dawn, the chill of the morning nipping at my skin. The forest wasn't too far from the main road, but far enough that the sound of cars soon faded into nothingness. I didn't mind the silence. There's something comforting about the quiet of nature, a soft kind of peace that wraps around you like a blanket. The trail was a narrow, winding path, littered with fallen leaves and pine needles. It was easy to follow at first, the way marked by small wooden signs, although they were few and far between. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground as I moved deeper into the forest. Every now and then, I could hear the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Squirrels, perhaps, or birds hopping from branch to branch. I wasn't sure how long I'd been walking when the path started to thin out. The trees grew denser, their trunks taller and more twisted, the canopy above blocking much of the light. I knew I was venturing off the beaten path, but it didn't bother me. I welcomed the challenge. After all, what was hiking if not an adventure? The trail faded into a barely noticeable path that seemed to disappear into the thick undergrowth. I paused for a moment, trying to figure out if I should continue. I had a map, but it wasn't very detailed. I figured that if I kept my bearings, I'd be fine. The further I went, the less I saw of other people. I hadn't encountered another hiker for hours. That fact alone gave me a sense of satisfaction, like I was discovering a place most people didn't know about. The deepening silence was both eerie and soothing, like the forest was holding its breath. By the time I decided to stop for a break, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. I found a large rock near a small stream that wound through the trees, its clear water sparkling under the fading light. I sat on the rock, taking off my backpack and pulling out a small snack. My surroundings felt almost surreal. The way the light filtered through the branches, the gentle sound of the water, the stillness of the air. It was peaceful, but in a way that made the quiet feel almost too heavy, like it was waiting for something. I finished my snack quickly, deciding to press on before it got too dark. It was late afternoon now, and the sun would be setting soon. I had hoped to make camp before nightfall, but I was starting to realize that might not happen. The forest was thicker now, with trees that seemed to close in on me as I walked. The path had all but disappeared, leaving nothing but tangled vines and overgrown brush. I found myself having to climb over fallen logs and dodge thorny bushes. Still, I pressed on. I had been on longer hikes before and knew how to handle myself. But as the sun sank lower in the sky, something changed. At first, it was subtle. The air grew colder, but not in a normal way. It wasn't just the temperature, it felt thicker, somehow. The light dimmed faster than it should have, and a strange tension hung in the air. The feeling was familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. It wasn't a danger I could see, but something deeper, something wrong. I stopped for a moment, scanning my surroundings. The trees here were different, not in an obvious way, but enough for me to notice. The trunks were crooked, twisting in unnatural shapes. The leaves, once vibrant with autumn colors, now seemed darker, almost gray. The silence around me felt heavier, pressing in on me. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. It wasn't the first time I'd felt uncomfortable in the woods. Nature had its way of throwing things off balance, but it usually passed. I forced myself to keep walking, but the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it intensified. The shadows seemed to grow longer and deeper, stretching across the forest floor in impossible ways. It was as if the forest itself was folding in on itself, drawing me deeper into its core. The sound of the stream had stopped, replaced by a strange, distant noise. It wasn't a rustle of leaves or the chirp of a bird, but something else. Something lower, more resonant, like a hum just on the edge of hearing. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, eager to find an open area where I could set up camp, but the deeper I went, the harder it became to move. The trail, if it could even be called a trail anymore, was barely visible. The undergrowth had taken over completely, and every step felt like it took twice the effort. My legs were starting to ache from climbing over fallen trees and thick brambles, but I kept going, driven by a growing need to find my way out of whatever this was. Then I saw it. Through the trees, there was a clearing. It was small, but it looked like it might lead to a more established trail or even an exit from the forest. I pushed myself forward, desperate to reach it. The moment my foot hit the clearing, I stopped in my tracks. The air here was different, still as if the world had held its breath. And then I noticed something strange. The ground. There were markings in the dirt, scratches, long and deep, like something large had dragged itself across the forest floor. The dirt was disturbed, and the air smelled faintly of something I couldn't identify. I crouched down, my curiosity getting the better of me, but then I saw it. A footprint. It wasn't human, that much was certain. It was large, almost unnaturally so, with deep indentations where the toes had pressed into the earth. The edges were ragged, and there was something about the shape that unsettled me. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. I wasn't alone. My first instinct was to turn and run, but I forced myself to stay calm. There was no sound, no movement around me. Still, the hairs on my arms stood on end as I scanned the clearing. Something was out there, something that was watching me. My throat was dry, my breath shallow as I tried to make sense of the situation. I took a step backward, then another, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. And then, from behind me, I heard it, a crack, the unmistakable sound of something heavy moving through the forest. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing, just trees. The shadows were growing longer, the light fading faster than I had expected. I turned to face the clearing again, trying to push the panic down. I had to get out of here, fast. I turned to retrace my steps, but something caught my eye, movement, just at the edge of the clearing. Something large, shifting between the trees. I froze, my body going rigid with fear. It wasn't an animal. It was too big, too wrong. It was like a shadow, but it had substance. The way it moved was unnatural, fluid but jerky, like it was unsure of its own form. I didn't think. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, dodging trees, tripping over roots, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of something following me was getting closer, too close. The trees blurred around me, and my mind raced with thoughts of what could be chasing me. But I couldn't stop, couldn't look back. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. But eventually, I stumbled into a narrow trail, the ground softer and easier to navigate. The moment I saw the path, I sprinted for it, not daring to look over my shoulder. Finally, after what felt like hours, I broke through the trees and emerged onto a wider trail. My legs were burning, my chest tight from the exertion, but I didn't stop. I didn't slow down until I reached the road, the faint hum of a car engine in the distance. I collapsed by the side of the road, gasping for air, my hands shaking. I didn't know what had happened in those woods, what I had seen or felt, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back, not ever. As I waited for help to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching me. And in that moment, I realized the forest doesn't just hold its breath for nothing. I had always loved hiking. The feeling of the wind brushing against my skin, the smell of pine trees, and the peaceful quiet of nature all made the long, tiring treks worth it. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the isolated trail I chose, a path that wasn't as popular as the others, or maybe it was the strange unease I felt as soon as I set foot on the dirt trail. It was a bright, early morning when I arrived at the trailhead, the sun still low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The weather forecast had been clear, no rain, mild temperatures. Just perfect for a solo hike. I packed my backpack with water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and a light jacket. I wasn't planning to stay out long, just a few hours, maybe a half-day hike. The trail I picked was a loop that led through a dense forest and then looped back to the same point. At least that's what the map said. The map seemed simple enough. A few winding paths, a couple of forks to watch out for. Nothing too complicated. There weren't many other cars parked in the lot, and the quietness of the place added to the feeling that I was truly alone. The first mile was easy, the path well-maintained and wide enough for me to move comfortably. I hiked briskly, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the towering trees around me. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of wet earth and the occasional flower that had yet to bloom. Birds chirped in the distance, and a small stream bubbled alongside the trail. But as I continued, I noticed something odd. The further I went, the quieter it got. The birds seemed to stop singing, and the wind, which had been a gentle breeze earlier, seemed to have calmed completely. It wasn't just the usual stillness you get when you're deep in a forest. It felt unnatural. I shrugged it off at first, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The trail started to narrow, the trees becoming thicker, the canopy above blocking out more and more light. The path twisted and turned in ways that were starting to confuse me. I checked my map, but the landmarks didn't seem to match what I was seeing. No signs, no recognizable features. I thought maybe I had taken a wrong turn, but I didn't remember any forks. The unease began to creep into my thoughts, but I pushed it down. I couldn't afford to lose focus. I needed to keep moving forward, even if it meant trusting my gut more than the map. The last thing I wanted was to get lost, so I kept walking one step after another. Around the second mile, I came across something strange. The trail split into two, but neither path seemed familiar. Both options seemed overgrown, with thick brush spilling out over the edges. I tried to recall the map in my mind. There should have been a fork around here, but nothing about this looked right. I chose the path on the left, thinking it would eventually loop back. I wasn't sure what drew me to that side, but I felt a slight pull, like something was telling me it was the right choice. I continued down the path, trying to push the unease back into the recesses of my mind. The air grew cooler. A breeze picked up, rustling the leaves in a way that didn't sound normal. It wasn't the usual peaceful whisper of the wind. It was almost like a low hum, as if the forest itself was vibrating. I stopped, trying to place the sound, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. I kept going. The trees began to grow denser, their trunks twisted and gnarled in strange shapes. It was as if I had entered a different part of the forest entirely, one that felt ancient, untouched by time. The sunlight barely reached the ground now, and the air seemed thick, making it harder to breathe. Suddenly, I heard something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a bird, maybe a squirrel rustling in the leaves, but it wasn't a typical forest sound. It was rhythmic, like footsteps. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was too deliberate to be an animal. I held my breath, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something strange while hiking. Nature often has a way of playing tricks on you, especially when you're alone in a forest. But this felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, listening to the silence, but eventually, I shook myself out of it. I couldn't just stand there, I had to keep moving. I turned to continue down the path, but my foot caught on something, and I stumbled. When I looked down, I saw what had caused me to trip. It was a large, weathered stone, half buried in the ground, with strange symbols etched into its surface. I knelt down to inspect it, the hairs on my neck prickling again as I traced the symbols with my fingers. They were unlike anything I had seen before. Some looked like a language, but it didn't seem to match any script I knew. I quickly stood up and took a step back, a sense of unease washing over me. It was just a rock, I told myself. Just a rock. But something about it didn't feel right. I looked around. The trees were unnervingly still, the silence almost oppressive now. I tried to shake off the feeling, but I couldn't. I had to get out of here. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but when I looked at the trail behind me, it seemed different. The path wasn't the same as it had been when I started. The trees seemed closer now, their trunks thicker and twisted. The air felt heavier. For the first time, a thought crossed my mind. I was lost. I tried to calm myself, but panic started to set in. I checked my phone for reception. Nothing. No signal. I looked at the map again, but it wasn't much help. The trail had become a maze of confusing turns and strange landmarks that didn't match anything I had seen earlier. The more I looked, the more I felt like I was spiraling deeper into this strange, forgotten part of the forest. The wind picked up again, whistling through the branches. The rhythmic footsteps returned, but this time, they were closer. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel them. The hairs on my neck stood up, and I quickened my pace, desperate to find a way out. Minutes passed. Hours maybe, I couldn't tell. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, and my legs were beginning to ache. My water was running low, and my stomach growled from hunger. I had made the mistake of underestimating the length of the trail. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing. At the edge of the clearing, there was a weathered wooden signpost, almost completely covered by ivy. I brushed aside the vines and read the words on the sign. It was a name I didn't recognize, and the trail was not marked in any way I understood. I felt a wave of dread settle over me. That's when I heard something I had not expected. A distant sound of running water, a stream or river. I was about to ignore it when a thought occurred to me. Maybe this was the way out. I decided to follow the sound of the water, praying it would lead me to a river or a lake where I could figure out my bearings. The forest had been so dense, so closed off, that I hadn't seen any signs of civilization in hours. The sound of the stream grew louder, and eventually, I found it. A wide, fast-moving river cutting through the forest. The water was clear and the riverbank was steep, but I could see that it led somewhere. Following the river would surely take me to a road or another trail. With renewed hope, I began walking along the river's edge, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. I couldn't see the sky anymore. The trees were too thick above, but the sound of the water was steady, and I clung to the sense of direction it gave me. The sun was beginning to set when I finally saw a break in the trees. There was a small clearing, and in the distance, I could see the faint outline of a road. My heart raced. I had made it. I was finally out. I pushed through the last few trees and stumbled onto the road. The first car that passed slowed down, and the driver rolled down their window. I didn't care about how I must have looked, disheveled and out of breath. "I need a ride," I said, my voice hoarse. The driver nodded, and I got in, grateful beyond words. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest. It seemed like any other forest from the car, but I knew better. Something had been wrong in there. The strange symbols, the unnerving silence, the feeling that I wasn't alone. It all haunted me, but I was safe now. For the rest of my life, I would never step foot in that forest again. I had always been the type of person who loved hiking. The quiet, the solitude, the simplicity of nature. It all gave me a kind of peace that nothing else could. So, when I decided to go on a solo hiking trip in the Appalachian Mountains, I wasn't expecting anything unusual. In fact, I was excited about the challenge. I had done solo hikes before, but this one was supposed to be different. It was supposed to be a test of endurance, an opportunity to push myself farther than ever before. The weather was perfect when I set out. The sky was a brilliant blue, the air crisp but not too cold, and the sun was just beginning to warm up the forest floor as I made my way along the trail. I was alone, but that didn't bother me. I was used to solitude when hiking, and the woods felt like an old friend. The trail was a bit rugged, narrow in places, but that only added to the challenge. I had my backpack, filled with water, food, a map, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. I always overpacked because I wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks. This trail, though, it seemed like one I could handle. The plan was simple. Take the trail for a few days, enjoy the solitude, and return home safely. But as I made my way deeper into the woods, something started to feel off. It wasn't obvious at first. It was subtle, like a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Usually, when you're hiking, there's the constant sound of birds, insects, and the rustling of leaves. But this time, it felt unnervingly silent. At first, I chalked it up to the time of day. Maybe the animals were all hiding from the midday heat. But as I moved forward, the silence grew more intense. It wasn't just quiet. It felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Still, I didn't think much of it. I kept walking. Around midday, I reached a point on the trail where it split into two paths. There were no signs, no clear markers, just two faint trails winding through the trees. I consulted my map, trying to make sense of which one would lead me to the campsite I had planned to stop at. After a few minutes of staring at the map, I realized that neither trail seemed to match up with what I had expected. My gut told me to stick with the trail on the right, but something in the pit of my stomach kept nagging at me. It was probably nothing, I thought, just the usual nervousness when you're deep in unfamiliar territory. So, I went with the trail on the right. The woods grew denser as I continued, and the trail became less defined. I had to be more cautious now, stepping over roots and rocks, making sure I didn't trip. I could feel my heart rate pick up. There was something unsettling about this section of the hike. The trees seemed too close, the shadows too dark. It felt as though the woods were closing in on me. By late afternoon, I was starting to regret my decision. I hadn't seen another person in hours, and the trail had grown increasingly difficult to follow. My phone had no signal out here, and though I carried a compass, it was hard to get a reliable reading with the dense canopy above me. I checked my watch, 4:30 p.m. I still had time to find my campsite, but I wasn't sure how much further I should go. That nagging feeling was stronger now, like I was being watched. It was at that moment that I heard it. The faint noise, just on the edge of my hearing. It was too far away to make out, but it wasn't the typical sounds of wildlife I was used to. It sounded almost like a shuffle, or maybe a twig snapping, but it wasn't rhythmic, like the steps of someone walking. No animal moved like that. I froze, listening carefully. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively gripped the walking stick I had with me. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal I hadn't seen yet, maybe a deer or a small bear, but my gut was telling me something else. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was nearby, watching me. I didn't wait to hear the noise again. My feet started moving before I even realized it. The panic wasn't full-blown yet, but my senses were on high alert. I picked up the pace, scanning my surroundings more intently now. The sunlight was starting to fade, casting long, eerie shadows across the trail. The feeling of being followed didn't stop. It was like there was someone just out of sight, walking parallel to me through the trees. I tried to reassure myself again, telling myself I was overreacting. But the crunching of leaves behind me was unmistakable. Every time I turned around, there was nothing, no one. At some point, I lost track of the trail. The trees were thicker, and the underbrush was more difficult to navigate. The trail I had been following seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a chaotic mess of roots and vines. My heart began to race. I was lost. How had I let this happen? I reached for my map again, but it was hard to focus. The light was waning, and the shadows were getting longer and darker. I needed to make a decision quickly. I knew I couldn't camp here, not without a clear path forward. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest seemed to have changed. Every direction I turned felt wrong. The trees felt like they were closing in, and the silence, the oppressive silence, was deafening. As I walked through the thickening underbrush, I heard it again. The shuffle, closer this time. It wasn't in my imagination. My heart pounded in my chest as I spun around, but once again, there was nothing there, only trees. And then, just as quickly as the sound had come, it stopped. That's when I saw the man. I don't know how I hadn't noticed him before. He was standing off to the side, partly hidden by the trees. He wasn't looking directly at me, but I could see him clearly enough. He was tall, wearing a green jacket and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. His hands were tucked into his pockets, and he wasn't moving. For a moment, neither of us moved. I was frozen. My first instinct was to run, but something stopped me. Something told me that would make it worse. I tried to speak, but my mouth was dry. I didn't even know what I would say. The man took a slow step toward me. His gaze was fixed on the ground in front of him, but as he moved closer, I saw that his clothes were covered in dirt and mud, as if he had been wandering out here for days. He finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "You shouldn't be here." The words hit me like a punch. My heart skipped a beat. I wanted to respond, to ask him who he was, but the fear was paralyzing. "You've strayed off the trail," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "You need to turn back. It's not safe." I wanted to ask more, to demand an explanation, but before I could gather the courage, he turned away, disappearing into the trees as silently as he had appeared. I didn't hesitate this time. I turned and ran. The forest was a blur as I sprinted, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there any longer. The sounds of the forest had come alive again, but now they felt like a distant memory, drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. It wasn't until I reached a clearing that I realized I had been running for nearly an hour. I stopped, panting, and looked around. The clearing was small, but it was open, no thick trees or winding trails. I was back on track. The path was just ahead, clearly marked now. The panic slowly started to ebb, and I forced myself to calm down. As the sun set and I finally made my way back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong with that hike from the very beginning. The silence, the strange feeling of being watched, and then that man, what had he meant by "it's not safe"? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going back. I would take a different trail next time, one that didn't lead me into the heart of a forest that seemed so eager to swallow me whole. The sun was still low in the sky when I set off, the air cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I'd been hiking in the mountains for a few hours now, the trail winding through dense forests and rocky outcrops. It was quiet, almost too quiet. The chirping of birds had faded into the background, and the rustling of leaves seemed distant, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I'd been here before many times, but today felt different. It's strange how the mind works on these hikes. Sometimes you forget how far you've come, lost in the rhythm of your steps, in the peaceful solitude that nature offers. I thought it was just the isolation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I wasn't sure anymore. There was a presence, an awareness I couldn't shake. The path ahead narrowed, a steep incline leading to a ridge. I paused, wiping the sweat from my brow and taking a deep breath. The air here was thinner, the mountain's altitude making every step feel a little heavier. The trail had been well marked up to this point, but as I looked ahead, the familiar signs of the path began to fade. There were no markers, no well-worn footsteps in the dirt, just thick underbrush and towering trees that seemed to close in, blocking out the early morning light. For a moment, I stood there, considering turning back. But then I thought of the view at the summit, the feeling of accomplishment that came from making it to the top. It wasn't far, maybe another hour or two. I had food, water, and the weather was still holding up. The last thing I wanted was to be the kind of person who turned back too soon. I pushed forward, my boots crunching over the dry, brittle leaves. The air grew cooler, and the shadows lengthened as the sun climbed higher. The path was still there, barely visible, but I could see the faint outline of a trail ahead. It twisted around rocks, over small streams, and through dense thickets of brush. The mountains seemed to change around me, every turn revealing something new. It wasn't long before I realized that the trail was becoming increasingly overgrown. The brush was thicker now, the once clear path almost completely obscured. I had to duck beneath low-hanging branches and step over fallen logs that blocked my way. I could feel my pulse quicken as the forest around me grew denser, quieter. The deeper I went, the more I felt that strange presence again. Something just out of sight, just out of reach. The trees seemed to be leaning in, their gnarled branches twisting and weaving together above me, creating an unnatural canopy that blocked out the sky. I knew I shouldn't be feeling this way. I was a seasoned hiker. I knew the terrain. Yet, with every step, the sense of unease grew stronger. I stopped again, my heart thudding in my chest. There was no sound, nothing at all. The birds were gone. The wind had stopped. I could hear nothing except the rush of my breath and the occasional creak of a tree in the distance. Felt wrong. I didn't know how to explain it, but something wasn't right. I looked around, scanning the surroundings. The trees were older here, their trunks twisted and covered in thick moss. The ground was damp, and the air smelled musty, like old earth. It felt like I had entered a place that had been untouched for centuries. Pushing the unease aside, I continued forward, determined to reach the summit. But then something caught my eye, something strange. A shape, a figure standing in the distance between the trees. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But then I saw it move. It was just a blur, a fleeting shape that disappeared into the undergrowth before I could make sense of it. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hairs on my neck stood up, and my instincts screamed at me to turn back, to run, to leave this place. But I didn't. I pressed on, my steps quickening. The path grew steeper, and the trees began to thin, their trunks spreading apart to reveal a clearing up ahead. Relief flooded through me as I saw the summit in the distance, just beyond the edge of the clearing. But as I stepped into the clearing, I felt it, an overwhelming sense of dread. The air was thick, heavy, as if the very land was pressing down on me. The wind, which had been silent for so long, suddenly stirred, carrying with it the scent of something foul. I turned in a slow circle, my eyes scanning the edges of the clearing, but there was nothing there. Then I saw it again, the figure, this time standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, its outline barely discernible against the dark forest behind it. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely. I didn't want to stay and find out. I didn't want to run, either, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stayed in this clearing for another moment, something terrible would happen. My legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the ground, but I forced myself to move. I turned toward the summit, determined to reach it and leave whatever this was behind me. But then, just as I took a step forward, I heard something, a snap, a twig breaking behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but the clearing was empty. The figure was gone. The trees stood silent, unmoving. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I was fine. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was almost at the summit. I just needed to keep going, and this strange feeling would pass. I pushed on, my mind focused on the path ahead. But the further I went, the stranger it became. The ground beneath my feet started to feel soft, almost sponge-like. My boots sank with each step, making it harder to move forward. The trees seemed to press in tighter, their branches low and heavy. The air grew colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. And then, just as I reached the final stretch of the trail, I heard it again, a whisper. It was faint, almost inaudible, but it was there. I stopped, my blood running cold. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer, but still indecipherable. Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going anymore, just that I needed to get out of this place. The ground beneath my feet was soft, and my legs burned with the effort of moving faster than I should. Branches whipped at my face, and I stumbled over rocks and roots, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I ran for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest, until I finally burst out of the trees and into the open. The ridge was ahead, the summit just a short distance away, and the trail leading down into the valley. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care what was behind me anymore. I just kept going, my legs burning as I descended the mountain at breakneck speed, until the trail finally began to level out. It was only when I reached the parking lot at the base of the mountain that I allowed myself to stop. I bent over, gasping for air, my chest heaving with the effort of the descent. I don't know what I experienced up there, whether it was my mind playing tricks on me or something more, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't be hiking that trail again. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the parking lot, I looked back up at the ridge. The forest seemed peaceful from here, calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Maybe it was just my nerves, but I wasn't about to find out. I never considered myself an experienced hiker, but I had always enjoyed spending time in nature. I wasn't the type to go on extensive, multi-day treks, but I liked the idea of getting out of the city and into the quiet, the solitude. It was an easy Saturday morning when I decided to hike the Pine Creek Trail, a moderately challenging route I'd read about online. It was located a couple of hours outside of town. Not too far, but enough to feel like an escape. The weather was perfect that morning. Clear skies, a crisp, cool breeze, and the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. I packed a light backpack with water, a couple of snacks, my phone, though I knew the signal would likely drop soon, and a jacket just in case. The trail was described as being surrounded by tall pines, with streams and small rivers running along it, and a few spots where you could stop to rest. It didn't sound too difficult, but it was supposed to be remote. I had no idea how remote until I started walking. The parking lot near the trailhead was mostly empty when I arrived. I noticed a few cars in the distance, but other than that, the place was still and quiet. That should have been my first red flag. Why wasn't anyone else hiking so early? But I brushed the thought off, grabbed my bag, and started the hike. The first mile or so was easy. The trail was well marked, and I could hear the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind, the soft crunch of dirt beneath my boots. I passed a few small creek beds and noticed some deer tracks in the mud, which gave me a sense of peace. It felt good to be outside, surrounded by the trees, the air clean and fresh. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. The sound of the wind and the occasional bird call was all I could hear. There were no other hikers in sight, but I figured they were ahead of me. After a while, the path began to narrow, and the trees grew thicker, blocking out much of the sunlight. The atmosphere shifted. The air felt colder, even though the temperature hadn't dropped much. I wasn't scared, but there was something unsettling about how quiet it had gotten. The trail was no longer winding through open areas, but led into a denser forest. The pines stood like silent giants, their branches casting long shadows across the ground. It wasn't long before I realized I had made a mistake. I hadn't paid close enough attention to the trail markers, and now I found myself standing at a fork in the path. The signs were worn and faded, making it difficult to determine which direction to take. One path seemed to lead toward a steep slope, the other disappeared deeper into the woods. I stood there for a moment, considering my options, before deciding to take the path that seemed to follow the slope. I wasn't lost, not yet, but as I continued, I noticed that the trail was becoming less distinct. Fallen trees, overgrown brush, and sharp turns made it harder to keep track of where I was headed. Still, I pressed on, figuring it would lead me to a scenic overlook or eventually reconnect with the main trail. The further I went, the more the environment around me seemed to change. The forest felt darker, thicker. The air was damp, and the ground was soft underfoot, as though the earth had absorbed too much water. The trail, if it could even still be called that, started to climb steeply. I paused, pulling out my water bottle for a quick drink, wiping the sweat from my brow. The sun had disappeared behind a cloud, and the chill in the air seemed to intensify. I told myself I wasn't lost, just off the beaten path, but deep down, I felt a flicker of doubt. My phone had no service, and there was no sound of anyone else nearby. I tried not to think about it. The last thing I wanted to do was panic. It wasn't long after that I noticed something strange. The trees around me seemed to be growing closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that felt unnatural. The path, or what I assumed was the path, had narrowed significantly, and the air seemed to thicken with a heavy, almost oppressive quality. The forest was silent. Not even the wind rustled through the trees. Then, I heard it, a sound from behind me. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. It was a crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, but it didn't make sense. I hadn't seen anyone in hours. I froze, my heart pounding, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. The sound was gone. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the wind or an animal. Maybe I was just overthinking things. I took another step forward, but the air around me felt increasingly dense, almost suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next few minutes are a blur. I remember the path sloping downward sharply, the trees growing tighter, the ground becoming uneven. I kept glancing behind me, but no one was there. The sound of footsteps never came again. I came to a small clearing, a narrow open space surrounded by dense trees. In the middle of the clearing was something strange, an old wooden box about the size of a small suitcase. It looked out of place, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The box was weathered, covered in moss, with no markings or labels. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to it. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. A trail marker? A lost item? But when I opened the box, there was nothing inside but dirt and old leaves. The air felt colder still as I stood there, staring down at it. And for a brief moment, I wondered if I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to find. A shiver ran down my spine. I closed the box and stepped away, but the unease that had settled in my chest wasn't going away. I didn't want to stay here any longer. I decided to turn back, retracing my steps, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that I was being watched. But as I started back toward the narrow path I had come from, something was different. The trees felt closer, the shadows longer. The trail wasn't as clear as it had been before. The overgrown brush seemed thicker. I was certain I hadn't strayed this far off course, but now I couldn't even recognize where I had been moments earlier. Panic began to creep in. I picked up my pace, the sound of my boots on the soft ground louder in my ears. My breath quickened, my heart hammering in my chest. I forced myself to keep calm, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. But the further I went, the more I felt the weight of the forest pressing in around me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, unmistakable this time. Crunching leaves, snapping twigs, just behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I turned back to the path and ran, faster than I thought possible, the sound of my breath heavy in my ears. I could hear the footsteps again, and I was sure they were getting closer. I didn't know if it was an animal, another hiker, or something else entirely. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of the woods. Somehow, I managed to find the fork in the trail I had passed earlier, the path leading back to the main trail, the one that would take me back to safety. My chest ached from the exertion, but I kept going, stumbling through the underbrush, my legs shaking from the adrenaline. The rest of the hike was a blur. I don't remember much, just the feeling of relief when I finally saw the parking lot ahead, the distant cars, the sunlight breaking through the trees once more. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept walking, faster now, not stopping until I was back at my car. The drive home was uneventful, but the silence in the car felt suffocating. I kept thinking about that box in the woods, the strange sensation that something had been following me, and the overwhelming feeling of isolation. I didn't talk to anyone about it when I got home. Not at first. I didn't need to. I just couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I heard about the Pine Creek Trail in the news. A local hiker had gone missing, and search teams had been combing the area for days. They didn't find anything. No trace of the person had been discovered. But I knew what I had felt. I knew what I had almost encountered. I had been hiking alone for the past few hours, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. It had rained the night before, and the trails were slick with mud, which made each step feel heavier, more deliberate. The forest around me was dense, with trees so tall and tightly packed that they seemed to swallow the daylight. Even though it was late morning, the sun barely pierced through the canopy, casting everything in a dim, almost eerie glow. Every creak of the branches above and rustle of leaves underfoot was amplified in the silence, creating a constant tension that kept me on edge. This trail wasn't a well-known one. I'd done my research before coming out here, but there were no glowing reviews online, no packed parking lots at the trailhead. It was the kind of place people didn't really talk about, and that's exactly why I chose it. I wasn't looking for a crowd. I just wanted some solitude and a few hours of peace away from the noise of city life. I had packed light, just enough water, a couple of energy bars, my phone, and a lightweight jacket. The path was narrow, winding between thick ferns and the occasional fallen log. My boots slid slightly with each step, but I was used to it. It wasn't until I turned a corner and saw something strange that I began to feel uneasy. It was a small clearing ahead, just big enough for me to stand in. There was something off about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The trees around the clearing seemed to form a natural ring, leaning in as if they were trying to guard whatever was inside. There was no sound here, not even the usual hum of insects or birds, just quiet, too quiet. In the center of the clearing, there was an old wooden chair. It wasn't anything special at first glance, just a simple folding chair with chipped paint and frayed ropes tied to the arms. It looked like something someone might have left behind, but the longer I stared at it, the more uneasy I felt. The chair was positioned in such a way that it faced directly at me, as if waiting for someone to sit in it. But no one was around. There was no evidence of anyone recently having been here. No discarded wrappers or bottles, no footprints in the mud. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the chair. The thought crossed my mind that maybe it was a prank, some bizarre thing left behind by other hikers for some reason I couldn't comprehend. But the longer I looked, the more my instincts told me to move on. I stepped forward, keeping my eyes on the chair, and that's when I heard it. Faint, distant sound. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the cracking of twigs. It was something different, something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. A snap, a branch breaking. It wasn't from above. It came from somewhere in the distance, behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and I instinctively looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the forest was empty, no one in sight. I laughed to myself, trying to shake the tension out of my muscles. "Just your imagination," I muttered under my breath, even though I knew it was probably more than that. There was something off about this whole place. Maybe it was the solitude, the quiet, or the way the air felt too thick. I forced myself to keep moving, stepping around the clearing. But then, as I rounded the edge, something caught my eye. On the other side of the clearing, barely visible through the thick brush, was another chair. A second one. It was nearly identical to the first. It wasn't there a moment ago, I was sure of it. I would have noticed. My pulse quickened. I hadn't heard anything, hadn't seen anyone. How could that chair have appeared out of nowhere? It wasn't possible. I backed up, my heart hammering in my chest. The clearing felt smaller now, more claustrophobic, as if the trees were closing in around me. I took another step back, and the snap of a twig behind me cut through the silence like a gunshot. This time, I knew it wasn't my imagination. I whirled around, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. There was nothing there. Nothing but the dense underbrush and the deep, silent forest. I stood still, listening, my ears strained for any sound that might give me a clue, anything to explain what was happening. But the forest was silent again. Too silent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that something or someone was watching me. I quickly turned back around, ready to make my way out of the clearing. But when I looked at the chairs again, my stomach twisted. Both of them were now turned slightly toward each other, as if they had been moved. Had I seen that right? They had definitely not been positioned like that before. A part of me wanted to just bolt, run back down the trail, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Instead, I took a deep breath, telling myself it was just my nerves, just my mind playing tricks. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, determined to ignore the discomfort crawling up my spine. But the air around me had changed. The temperature had dropped, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I felt like I was being led into something, some kind of trap, but I couldn't explain why. I made it a few more steps when I noticed the trail narrowing, becoming steeper and more treacherous. The ground beneath me became loose, gravel shifting with each step. I had to focus now, my concentration drawn entirely to not losing my footing. But as I continued, I heard the unmistakable sound of something moving in the underbrush to my right. I paused, my heart leaping into my throat. Whatever it was large. It was coming closer, just out of sight. I squinted into the thickening forest, trying to see through the trees and shadows. The sound stopped, and then, to my horror, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. I was no longer alone. I couldn't see who or what was out there, but I knew it was real. No imagination could account for the heavy, deliberate footfalls I was hearing now. My breathing grew shallow, and I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I tried to find a signal, any connection to the outside world. Nothing. I looked around wildly, searching for any kind of shelter or way out. But the trees were dense, and the trail ahead of me only got steeper, more dangerous. I couldn't go back, and I couldn't stay still. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. Just then, a loud snap echoed from behind me. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone or something there, but nothing was in sight. I knew I had to move to get out of the woods, but fear kept me rooted in place. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft, almost a breath, but it was unmistakable. Run. The voice was quiet but clear. My blood ran cold. I didn't think. I turned and sprinted, adrenaline flooding my system. My boots slipped on the muddy trail, but I pushed forward, my body screaming for rest, for safety. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get out of there. The trail was winding now. The trees seemed to be moving, leaning closer as I ran. But as I rounded a bend, I saw it, the end of the trail, the familiar clearing at the edge of the forest, the parking lot just beyond. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. I broke through the last few meters of dense underbrush and burst into the open space of the lot. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I sat there for what felt like hours, just trying to catch my breath, trying to shake the panic that had gripped my chest. What had happened back there? What was out there in the woods with me? Eventually, I calmed down enough to drive away, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I didn't say a word to anyone when I got home, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the footsteps in the forest, and I knew that I'd never go back to that trail again. The sun had barely risen when I decided to take on the trail. The air was crisp, the kind of coolness that makes the morning feel like a fresh start. I had been hiking this route before, but not in months, and not since I'd gotten a bit too comfortable with the idea of sticking to well-traveled paths. This time, though, I wanted something different, something more remote, something that felt untouched. I had heard about a section of the woods that few people venture into, known for its dense thickets, sharp rocks, and sudden drops. It wasn't technically dangerous, but it had a reputation for making the unprepared feel small. I didn't mind. In fact, I liked the idea of being alone in a place where most people wouldn't dare go. Packing a light backpack with only the essentials: water, a granola bar, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my phone. I set out early, hoping to beat the rush of weekend hikers. The trailhead was quiet, the kind of quiet that had a certain tension to it, like the kind you feel right before a storm. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the early hour. The sounds of birds were the only thing accompanying me at first, but even those were sparse. The path started off easy, just a wide dirt trail through the trees. The scent of pine filled my nose as I breathed in deeply. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves above me, and the occasional chipmunk scurried across the ground. I thought about how much I had missed this, the peace of nature, the feeling of getting lost without actually losing your way. It wasn't until I hit the first fork in the trail that things started to feel off. The sign was old, its lettering faded and chipped. There were two options. One led in the direction of a well-maintained, easy route, and the other veered left into a narrow, overgrown passage. A small arrow was painted on the sign pointing toward the left, though the wood seemed almost to resist the effort, like the sign itself didn't want to point me down that path. I paused for a moment, considering. I'd read a bit about this route, the one that veered left. It was known to be more challenging, with no clear markers or signs along the way. But it wasn't the danger that made me hesitate. It was the silence. The forest felt different here, as if the air itself had thickened. I shook my head. I had come for an adventure, hadn't I? I couldn't back down now. I stepped onto the left trail, my boots crunching the dry leaves beneath them. The first few hundred yards were easy enough, with the trees thickening around me but still allowing the sunlight to filter through. As I moved deeper, the path narrowed, and I found myself ducking beneath branches that had bent over time, forming an almost arch-like canopy above. The ground was uneven, and I had to step carefully, avoiding rocks that jutted up at odd angles. But then, the trail started to descend sharply, a steady, steep incline that made my calves burn. The rocks beneath my boots were loose in places, and I had to watch every step, constantly shifting my weight to maintain balance. I had to take more frequent breaks to catch my breath, the steepness taking a toll on me. Each time I paused, I could feel the isolation around me. There was no sign of another hiker, no distant murmur of voices. The only sound now was the pounding of my own heart in my ears and the occasional scuffle of something in the underbrush. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a squirrel, but deep down, I felt a gnawing sense of unease. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, but it was there, that quiet sense of being watched, as though the woods themselves were keeping an eye on me. Still, I kept moving forward. After all, I had only just begun. The trail split again. This time, there was no sign. The path diverged into two narrow lines, each disappearing into dense thickets of brush. I stopped, unsure of which way to go. There were no markings, no indication of which direction was more traveled, and the air was thicker now, almost stifling. The light had shifted slightly, though it was still early enough in the day for me to see clearly. I wasn't sure why, but my gut told me that this wasn't just another choice between two paths. Felt wrong. I stood there for a long moment trying to decide. The silence was so deep it pressed against me, and in the distance, I thought I heard a rustling that wasn't from the trees. A faint crackle, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It was so soft I could have imagined it, but I wasn't sure. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles, but also of something off. The scent of decay. Maybe I picked a direction, the one that felt less intrusive. The thicket opened up after a few minutes into a small clearing. It was peaceful, almost idyllic at first glance. The sunlight filtered through the leaves in golden beams, illuminating the damp earth below. But then, I noticed something odd. There were no signs of animal life. No birds singing, no squirrels darting from tree to tree. The place felt still, and the longer I stood there, the more that stillness began to gnaw at me. I continued through the clearing, my nerves beginning to fray. The path here wasn't much of a path at all. It was barely a trace of where someone might have walked, overgrown and uneven. Every few steps, I had to push my way through thick brambles, the thorny bushes catching on my sleeves. Suddenly, I felt a sharp prick in my leg, a burning pain where a thorn had caught my skin. I yelped, stumbling backward into something hard. The noise echoed, bouncing off the rocks behind me. My heart skipped a beat, and then I heard it, a low guttural sound. I froze, my blood turning cold. The sound wasn't a growl or a whistle from the wind. It was something else, something far too close. The kind of noise that made every instinct in my body scream to run. I slowly turned my head, scanning the surroundings. Nothing. The trees stood silent. The bushes were still. But that sound, that horrible noise, seemed to hang in the air. It was closer now. My legs felt heavy. My mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. Was it an animal? I had to think quickly to prepare myself. I scanned the ground for a branch or something to defend myself with, but I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows between the trees. The silence pressed in again, and then, like an answer to some unspeakable question, I saw it. A figure barely more than a blur between the trees. It moved too fast for me to make out any details, but the way it moved was unnatural, like something was dragging it through the woods. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that whatever it wasn't human. I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me, and I turned, running in the opposite direction. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop. My chest tightened with each breath as I pushed through the undergrowth, branches slapping at my face and arms. The forest around me had become a maze. I was no longer following any path, just running, desperate to get away. I wasn't sure how long I ran. The world had become a blur of trees and brush, the only sound the pounding of my feet against the dirt. But eventually, the terrain shifted. The ground grew flatter, the forest opening up to an area that felt different. I stumbled into a wide, open space. The trees thinned out, and I could see the sky above me. I stopped, gasping for air, my chest heaving. I looked around, my mind racing. I had no idea where I was now, but the sound of movement behind me had stopped. The silence was back, but it wasn't the same. It was peaceful now. I took slow, deep breaths, trying to calm myself. The figure in the woods wasn't behind me anymore. Whatever it was, it hadn't followed me out into this clearing. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings. The forest around me was quiet again, just the normal sounds of nature. The panic slowly faded, replaced by a deep exhaustion. I didn't know what I had just experienced, whether it had been a trick of my mind or something else entirely, but I had made it out, and I was no longer alone in those woods. I stood there for a while, letting my breath return to normal. When I felt steady enough, I turned around and began the slow walk back to the trailhead. Every step was deliberate now, every snap of a twig underfoot making my heart race. The familiar path back felt like a comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me, waiting for me to stray too far. By the time I finally emerged from the woods, the sun was high in the sky. The trailhead was bustling with other hikers, all oblivious to the tension that had gripped me out there. But I knew I would never look at those woods the same way again. The feeling that something had been watching me, tracking me, would stay with me long after the trail had faded from view. I don't know what it was I felt out there, but I knew one thing. Sometimes the wild places aren't as empty as we like to think. I never thought hiking would be anything more than a simple way to enjoy the outdoors. The idea of a solitary hike up a mountain, surrounded by trees and the quiet rustle of leaves, seemed peaceful, maybe even therapeutic. I always felt a sense of accomplishment after a good climb, the kind where you reach the summit and catch your breath, looking out over the landscape. That's how it had always been, until that one hike, the one that ended up changing everything. Started out like any other. I had planned a solo trip up a well-known trail near a national park. A few friends had done it before, and their stories always made it seem like a great idea. "You'll love it," they'd said. "It's beautiful up there." The trail was a bit challenging, but nothing I couldn't handle. It wasn't even considered dangerous, according to the locals. So, with that in mind, I packed my gear. A small tent, some snacks, water, my hiking boots, a first aid kit, and a flashlight. The essentials. I made sure everything was checked and double-checked before I left. I parked my car in the small lot at the trailhead, and the first thing that hit me was the smell of pine. That earthy, fresh scent you only get in dense forests. The sun was still low in the sky, casting golden light through the trees, and there was a crispness in the air that made the hike feel refreshing. As I laced up my boots and adjusted my pack, I felt a sense of excitement. This was going to be great. I set my sights on the path ahead, a narrow dirt trail that cut through thick woods, and I began walking. The trail was well marked, and I had no trouble following it. First, it was easy. The terrain was gentle, a slight incline with some loose gravel here and there. Birds chirped, and the leaves above me rustled as a soft wind blew through the treetops. The sound of my boots crunching the dirt was the only other noise, and it felt oddly comforting. I wasn't the type to talk to myself, but in moments like this, when you're alone in nature, it feels like you're the only one who truly exists in the world. There's a peacefulness in it, and I let it wash over me. As I made my way deeper into the woods, I began to notice something strange. The trail was slowly becoming more rugged, the path less defined, as if the forest itself was pushing back. I'd read about this, how some trails could change depending on the time of year and the weather. The occasional fallen tree lay across the path, and the underbrush grew thicker. But it didn't concern me too much at first. I just pushed on, thinking I could always turn back if it became too difficult. The first sign that something was off came about an hour into the hike. I came to a clearing, the kind where the trees pull back, allowing sunlight to spill in. The ground was soft with moss, and there was a large, flat rock in the center, perfect for resting. I sat down, took a sip from my water bottle, and stretched my legs. The silence here was different. It wasn't the same tranquil quiet I'd been enjoying earlier. This was more oppressive. The birds had stopped singing, and the air felt a little too still, almost as if the forest had grown tired of me being there. I shook it off and decided to keep moving. The trail was still marked, but the further I went, the more it seemed to deviate. At first, it was subtle, a slight shift in direction, a turn that didn't quite match the map I had. I kept my head down, focusing on my steps, but the unease was starting to creep in. Every time I looked up, the trees seemed denser. The light from the sun filtered through a thick canopy above. The sense of being watched grew stronger with each step. I continued on, pushing through the discomfort. I had come this far. There was no turning back now. The trail seemed to narrow, the forest closing in around me. The path twisted and turned, and I found myself having to step over roots and navigate through thick brush. The air felt heavier, and the quiet became unbearable. Not a single bird call, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as though all life had abandoned this place. Then came the sounds. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Branches snapping, twigs breaking under the weight of something. But as I paused and listened, it became clear. There was something moving behind me. It was subtle, almost too quiet to be certain, but it was there. A rustling just out of sight. My heart began to beat faster. Maybe it was another hiker, I told myself, but I hadn't seen anyone since I left the parking lot. I didn't want to let myself believe I was alone in these woods, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being followed. I sped up my pace, hoping to shake off whatever or whoever was behind me. But no matter how fast I walked, the rustling kept pace. It was always just out of sight, the sound moving parallel to me. My breath quickened, and I forced myself not to panic. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or something, but even that seemed unlikely. This didn't feel like the peaceful woods I had entered just hours earlier. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see nothing. But there, in the shadows just beyond the trees, I caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of something too fast for me to identify. My heart jumped into my throat. I pushed forward now, my mind racing. Why was I so far off track? Where was the familiar trail? Where were the markers that should have been guiding me? My stomach churned with a cold dread. I was lost, really lost. My hands began to shake as I pulled out my map and tried to make sense of where I was. But the path before me seemed to contradict everything I had studied. That's when the real panic set in. The sun, which had been so high when I started, was now dipping lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I could feel the temperature dropping, the coolness creeping in. I knew I needed to find a safe place to camp for the night, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more disoriented I became. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore, that whatever had been following me was still out there. I stumbled on, desperate for any sign of a proper trail. It wasn't long before I found it. An old, weathered sign. It was barely legible, but I could make out the words "dangerous area," with a few arrows pointing in different directions. Panic flooded my chest. Had I wandered into an off-limits zone? Why hadn't I noticed this earlier? I had to make a decision. The sun was now low, and the sky was turning dark purple. I could either try to find my way back to the parking lot, which felt miles away at this point, or I could find a spot to camp here for the night and wait until morning. Neither option felt right, but I had no choice. I set up my tent hastily, my hands still trembling. My head was spinning, and every sound in the forest felt like a warning. The rustling behind me had stopped, but the air still felt wrong. I curled up in my sleeping bag, my mind racing, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But every crack of a branch, every breeze, sent a jolt of fear through me. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I fell asleep fitfully, my dreams full of shadows and strange movements in the trees. When I woke up, it was still dark, but the rustling had returned. This time, I couldn't ignore it. There was no animal this time. This time, I could hear footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps, moving through the forest towards me. I wasn't alone. Started out as a simple plan, just me, my backpack, and the mountains. I'd been on plenty of solo hikes before, so this wasn't anything out of the ordinary. I was used to the peaceful quiet of the forest, the sound of my boots crunching the leaves, and the occasional bird call overhead. I had a map, enough water, and food for the day. The weather was perfect, sunny with a slight breeze, not a cloud in the sky. I had parked my car at the trailhead around 8 in the morning, when the air still had a cool edge to it. The trail was marked clearly, a winding path that ran through dense woods before opening up to a ridge that promised spectacular views. I had done this hike before, but it had been a couple of years, and I was looking forward to revisiting the familiar scenery. As I started walking, the path was easy enough to follow, a soft dirt trail that was slightly muddy in spots from the morning dew. The trees were tall, their leaves a mix of green and yellow as the season was just beginning to shift into fall. The sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. Birds flitted above me, and I could hear the occasional rustling in the underbrush. It felt peaceful, almost like I was the only person in the world. A few hours passed, and I had made good progress. The trail narrowed and became steeper, but I didn't mind. The hike was a good workout, and I was enjoying the solitude. As I rounded a bend in the path, I noticed a strange smell. It wasn't anything specific at first, just something off. A faint, acrid scent that hung in the air. It was a smell I couldn't quite place, but it didn't feel right. I stopped for a moment, trying to pinpoint the source. The forest around me seemed unchanged, still lush, still green. But the smell persisted, faint but undeniable. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the scent of some animal or something decomposing. Nothing to worry about. I kept walking. I reached a small clearing around noon, where the trail branched off in two directions. One path led upward, toward the ridge I wanted to reach, while the other wound around a small hill. There was a faded wooden sign pointing left, indicating a small side trail. I didn't remember this from the last time I hiked here, but I figured it might be an alternate route to the top. Curious, I decided to check it out. The side trail was narrow, overgrown with tall grass and thorns. It felt less maintained than the main path, and I had to push through a few tangles of brush. But the further I went, the more the path seemed to open up again, and eventually, I came to a small creek. The water flowed gently, and the sound of it rushing over the rocks was soothing. I crouched down to take a drink, feeling the cool water splash against my lips. That's when I noticed something strange. There, by the water's edge, was a pile of small rocks. It wasn't a cairn, like hikers sometimes build as trail markers. It was more like someone had carefully placed each stone, forming an odd pattern. I knelt down to inspect it, and I could feel a slight chill run down my spine. The rocks weren't natural. They had been placed with intent, arranged almost like a ritual. But for what purpose? I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. I knew the woods could sometimes be a bit offbeat, but this felt different. This wasn't some harmless sign of another hiker passing through. There was something deliberate about it. I stood up quickly, brushing off the unease creeping into my thoughts. Probably just a random thing, I told myself, trying to shake off the feeling. I didn't linger long. The feeling of being watched crept up on me again as I made my way back to the main trail, almost like there were eyes hidden in the trees, just out of sight. The sense of unease grew stronger with each step. It was a subtle feeling, nothing outright threatening, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The rest of the hike felt different after that. The peaceful quiet had given way to an unsettling silence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I pressed on, my pace quickening. The ridge was just ahead, and I wanted to reach it, to put some distance between myself and the strange side trail. But as I rounded the last curve before the summit, something stopped me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, shadows playing off the rocks. But as I squinted into the distance, I realized there was something on the ridge, just beyond the trees. A figure standing still, watching me. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure if it was a person or something else, but I could make out the outline of someone standing motionless against the backdrop of the sky. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. It was as if it had just appeared out of nowhere. I had to make a choice. I could turn back, retrace my steps, and take the safer route down. Or I could keep going, confront whatever was out there, and finish the hike as planned. I decided to move forward, though every instinct in my body screamed to turn around. Slowly, I walked toward the ridge, my eyes never leaving the figure. It remained still, its silhouette barely distinguishable against the fading light of the afternoon. When I finally reached the top, the figure was gone. I scanned the area, my breath coming in shallow gasps. There was no sign of anyone. The ridge was empty, just a few scattered rocks and a view of the valley below. It was peaceful. Too peaceful. The wind whispered through the trees, but there was no sign of life, no movement at all. I stood there for a long time trying to steady my nerves. I had to be imagining things. Maybe it was just someone else on the trail, someone who'd moved on without me noticing. Or maybe it had been nothing at all, a trick of my tired eyes. But deep down, I knew I wasn't completely convinced. As the sun began to set, I decided it was time to head back to the trailhead. I had seen enough for one day. The shadows lengthened as I made my way down the ridge, the trail now more difficult to see in the fading light. I felt like I was rushing, even though I wasn't in any immediate danger. The woods around me grew darker with every step. The familiar trail seemed unfamiliar now, like it was shifting, changing. And that's when I heard it, a rustling not far behind me. It wasn't an animal, though it was too loud, too deliberate. It was the sound of something moving through the underbrush at a steady pace, following me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was empty. Just trees, just shadows. Nothing moving, nothing to explain the sound. But I could still feel it. Someone or something was there. I didn't look back again after that. I kept moving, my pace quickening to a near run. The trail blurred past me as I tried to stay calm, but the rustling behind me grew louder, closer. By the time I reached the car, I was breathless, shaking from head to toe. There was no one there, no one following me. But the feeling of being hunted lingered long after I slammed the car door shut. I don't know what happened that day, but I can tell you this. When I left the woods, I didn't feel like I was leaving alone. The sun was beginning to set when I set out on my hike. It wasn't a particularly long trail, just a few miles through the woods, but it was a trail I had hiked before. I knew the way. I had walked these woods countless times, familiar with every bend, every tree, every rock. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous, just a peaceful way to clear my mind and enjoy some fresh air, or so I thought. I had parked my car in the small lot by the trailhead, the dirt road crunching under the tires as I pulled in. There were only a couple of other cars there, parked a little too far apart for it to seem like a group was out for a hike. I figured they must have been ahead of me already. The weather was perfect, a cool breeze, clear skies, the sun casting long shadows over the forest floor. I laced up my boots, grabbed my water bottle and started walking, the trail wide enough for a single person but not so narrow that I couldn't move easily. The trees were tall here, their trunks thick and the branches tangled in a way that made the woods feel more alive. The sound of birds and the rustling of leaves in the wind was all I could hear, except for the occasional crunch of leaves beneath my feet. The first part of the trail was easy, a smooth path that wound around a creek. The water was clear, sparkling as it flowed over rocks, and the sound of it running added a peaceful undertone to the air. I stopped for a moment to take a drink, staring at the water as it moved, watching the way it twisted and turned around the rocks, never pausing, always going forward. It made me think about how life keeps moving no matter what. I continued walking, my boots hitting the trail with a steady rhythm. As I got deeper into the forest, the path began to narrow, the trees growing closer together. The sunlight flickered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. There was something strangely calming about the way the forest felt, like I was walking through a space that was both old and timeless. This wasn't the first time I had hiked here, but there was something different about today. Maybe it was the quietness, the way the birds seemed to have fallen silent. Or maybe it was the feeling of being completely alone in the wilderness. I hadn't seen anyone since I passed the other cars, and the thought didn't bother me. I preferred solitude when I hiked. It allowed me to think, to be with my own thoughts. But the deeper I went, the more that nagging feeling grew. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense of unease. Something wasn't quite right. The trail began to climb, the incline steeper than I remembered. I wasn't out of shape, but the climb was more demanding than I had expected. I wiped the sweat from my brow and slowed my pace, trying to catch my breath. It wasn't long before I came across a sign, one I didn't remember from previous hikes. It was old, the wood cracked and faded, with the words "Dead Man's Ridge" written in worn letters. I had heard the name of the ridge before, but I didn't know much about it. There were stories, of course, local legends about hikers who'd gotten lost or fallen off the cliffs, but they were just that, stories. I didn't believe in them. Still, the name gave me pause, and for a brief moment, I wondered if I should turn back. But I didn't. I pushed the thought aside and kept walking. The forest was quieter now, the only sound coming from the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I had reached the ridge itself, a long, rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out for miles, the trees below forming a sea of green, the distant hills fading into a hazy blue. For a moment, I felt a rush of excitement. I was alone up here, and it felt like the entire world was mine. I sat down on a rock to rest, enjoying the silence. There were no other hikers here, no distant voices calling out, no sounds of footsteps. It was just me and the woods. But as I sat there, I felt that familiar unease creeping back. It was subtle at first, just a quiet thought in the back of my mind, but it grew stronger. Something didn't feel right. I scanned the area around me. The trees were dense, their trunks twisted and gnarled, the underbrush thick with bushes and vines. There was no sign of anyone else, no sign of any animals either. It was too quiet, almost unnervingly so. I stood up, brushing the dirt off my pants, and glanced around again. That's when I noticed it. Footprints in the dirt, just ahead of where I had been sitting. At first, I thought nothing of it. Hikers leave footprints. But these weren't the clean prints I was used to seeing on the trail. These were deeper, as if someone had been rushing, their steps heavy and quick, and they led off the trail into the dense woods. For a moment, I debated whether to follow the prints. They weren't far, just a few yards off the trail, but the fact that they seemed so out of place unnerved me. After all, I had just walked this way, and there had been no one around, but my curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the path, following the prints as they wound through the trees. The farther I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. The air grew thick, the shadows longer, and the sound of the wind through the branches was the only thing keeping me company. The footprints led me to a small clearing, the kind of place you'd expect to find a campfire ring or some sign of other hikers. But there was nothing here, just a small patch of bare earth where the ground had been disturbed. And then, as I looked closer, I saw it. Something shiny in the dirt. I knelt down, brushing away the leaves and soil, revealing a small silver locket. I turned it over in my hands. There was no engraving on it, just a smooth surface. But it felt wrong, as if it didn't belong in this place. I stood up and looked around again, but the silence was all-encompassing. It felt like I was the only person in the world. I should have turned back then. The sensible thing would have been to retrace my steps, get back to the trail, and leave the forest behind. But I didn't. I couldn't explain why, but something about the locket pulled me in. I slipped it into my pocket and continued deeper into the woods, ignoring the voice in the back of my mind telling me to stop. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together in a way that made the forest feel like a maze. The trail was no longer visible, and I found myself stumbling over roots and uneven ground. The footprints were still there, leading me onward, and I followed them even though I knew it was a bad idea. That's when I heard it. A sound, faint at first, like a whisper on the wind. I stopped, straining to hear. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was a voice. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, listening, but the voice was gone as quickly as it had come. I stood there for a long moment, feeling my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to call out, but the air felt too thick, too heavy. So I just stood there, frozen, until the forest fell silent again. The unease was now full-blown fear. I turned and started retracing my steps, trying to find the trail again, but everything looked the same. The trees were too close together, the underbrush too thick. It felt like the forest was swallowing me whole. I quickened my pace, my breath coming faster, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the way back. I don't know how long I wandered, but when I finally stumbled upon the familiar trail, the sun was nearly gone. The sky had darkened, and the temperature had dropped, leaving the forest cold and silent. I was disoriented, my legs aching from the long hike, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I made it back to the car just as the last light of day faded, the trailhead now deserted. I sat in the car for a while, catching my breath, my mind racing. There was no explanation for what had happened. No one had been out there with me. No one could have left those footprints. No one could have whispered those words, but I knew what I had heard. And the locket, it stayed in my pocket, cold and heavy, reminding me that sometimes the woods hold secrets that shouldn't be uncovered. The morning had started with perfect weather, as any hiker would want. Clear skies, crisp air, and a quiet, untouched wilderness surrounding me. I had decided to take a solo hike that day, my backpack packed with essentials, water, snacks, a map, and my trusty compass. I wasn't a rookie hiker, so this trail, though not well known, didn't seem intimidating to me. The idea of pushing myself, spending the day alone in the woods, was exactly what I needed after weeks of work stress and city noise. It was a well-marked trail that led up to a ridge overlooking a valley. I had read online that it was an easy hike, no steep climbs, mostly a moderate elevation gain, and I trusted the advice. There were no warnings of dangerous conditions, no mention of animals or wild weather. The day was ideal for hiking, and I was excited to finally be out in nature. I set off at a steady pace, my boots crunching on the dirt and leaves beneath me. The trail wasn't crowded, but that was exactly how I liked it. Every now and then, I could hear the distant sound of birds or the occasional rustle in the brush, but nothing felt threatening. I had walked this kind of path 1,000 times before, each step grounding me more in the silence of the wilderness. A couple of hours passed, and I stopped to rest by a stream, letting the cool water trickle over my fingertips. I took a sip from my water bottle, refilled it, and glanced at the map to check my progress. According to the map, I was close to the halfway point, which gave me a sense of comfort. But as I started walking again, the feeling of familiarity began to fade. The trail, which had been wide and clear, started narrowing. The path was still visible, but it felt different now. The trees, which had once stood in neat rows, now crowded the trail, their branches reaching out like hands. The ground beneath me grew uneven, and I found myself carefully navigating around loose rocks and thick roots that snaked across the path. The air felt heavier, too, as though something was pressing in from all sides, but I shrugged it off. I had read that the trail grew more rugged as you neared the ridge. The change in the environment didn't faze me much, but something about it felt off. The chirping of birds had quieted, replaced by an unsettling silence. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I dismissed it quickly, blaming my imagination for running wild. I pushed forward, even though the path ahead didn't seem as well defined as it had earlier. There were moments when I found myself scanning the trees for some kind of marker, but I couldn't spot one. At some points, the trail seemed to disappear altogether, replaced by uneven patches of earth, where a misstep could easily lead to an ankle twist. The air felt colder now, too, as I made my way deeper into the forest. What had started as a sunny morning had shifted into a gray, overcast sky. It didn't seem like rain, but there was a sudden chill in the wind. I zipped up my jacket, trying to ignore the creeping discomfort that was starting to settle in. After what felt like an eternity of walking through the increasingly difficult trail, I came across something strange, a large rock formation that seemed out of place. It was a jagged cliff, and the base of it was covered in thick, dense shrubs. I had no recollection of seeing anything like it on the map, but there it was, standing like some kind of barrier. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but something about that rock felt wrong. It wasn't a normal part of the trail, and its shape was too abrupt, too unnatural. But there was no sign indicating any kind of detour or warning. The map said I should be approaching the ridge soon, so I decided to press forward. As I made my way around the rock, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on my neck prickled again, and I turned sharply, half expecting to see someone or something standing behind me. But there was nothing. No animals, no people. Just the trees, staring at me with their endless, unblinking eyes. I kept walking. The trail, which had already been rough, grew more treacherous. The loose dirt made my steps slip, and my boots, which had been comfortable all morning, now felt too heavy. The wind picked up, rustling through the leaves above. For a moment, I stopped and looked around. The trees stretched high above, but the sky was darkening. It was strange, though the sun was still up, but the woods had taken on a twilight feel. A low sound broke the silence, something rustling in the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't an animal sound, though. It was a scraping noise, as though something was being dragged across the ground. I held my breath, waiting for the noise to stop, but it didn't. It grew louder. I slowly turned to my left and saw it. A figure standing in the woods, partially hidden behind the trees. First, I thought it was a person, but there was something wrong. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. I squinted, my eyes trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs were too long. It wasn't wearing clothes, but its skin, or whatever it was a shade of brown so dark that it almost blended with the bark of the trees. The thing's eyes were dark, almost black, and they locked onto mine. I could feel a coldness radiating from it, a sense of dread that sunk into my bones. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move, frozen by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. I blinked rapidly, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. I took a step forward, my breath coming in short gasps. The trail ahead looked the same, but the unease in my gut only grew stronger. I walked faster now, my eyes darting around, checking the trees, the shadows, anything that could explain the feeling I had in my gut. I had to keep moving. I told myself that it was just my nerves playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched never left. It wasn't long before I reached the ridge, the destination I had set out for. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched below me, a patchwork of green and brown, dotted with patches of wildflowers. The sun was now struggling to break through the clouds, casting light over the valley in patches. It was peaceful, serene, and for a brief moment, the terror I had felt earlier began to fade. I sat down on a large rock, taking in the view. I knew I would have to make my way back soon, but for now, I allowed myself to enjoy the solitude. The eerie feeling had dissipated, replaced by the quiet hum of nature. The birds had returned, and the breeze felt warmer. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the trees below me. It was a shadow, darting between the trunks of the trees. I couldn't make out what it was, but I could tell that it was too big to be an animal. I felt my stomach drop, my pulse quickening again. This time, I didn't wait to see what it was. I grabbed my pack, slinging it over my shoulder, and began to make my way back down the trail as fast as I could. The hike back was a blur. My mind was focused entirely on getting out of those woods. I didn't stop to rest, didn't look around. I kept moving, my boots pounding against the dirt trail, my breath coming faster and faster. The feeling of being followed never left me, even though I saw no one. It was as if the woods themselves were alive, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. By the time I reached the end of the trail, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path. I was exhausted, my legs sore, but the weight on my chest had lifted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, that the woods had tried to keep me. I didn't linger. I didn't even look back as I drove away from the trailhead, the forest now just a dark blur in my rearview mirror. And as I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder, had I truly been alone out there, or had the woods been hiding something all along? I didn't know, but I would never return to that trail again.